Well, it's 30 September 2006, and it's Vint Cerf off camera interviewing Robert E. Kahn on the occasion of the Computer History Museum Fellows Program. Bob will be inducted as a fellow later on in the year, and this interview is for purposes of capturing his history in our Computer History Museum archives. The questions that I'm going to ask Bob initially are more or less a pro forma set of questions that we ask everyone, after which we'll go into much more specific questions about Bob's history. So the people who are interested will have some specifics. But let's start out, Bob, with some very simple, straightforward things. Where did you grow up?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, I'm told. Don't recall the exact moment, but I recall that history. I lived in Brooklyn until I was about 13 years old.
So is there any reason to think that you weren't actually born in Brooklyn and you were only told that?
No, I think I was born in Brooklyn.
All right, fair enough.
There are some people who can remember, they claim, back then. I sort of remember my youth sort of from about the age of 6 or 7. I have sort of vague recollections of things before then. But we lived in Brooklyn until I was about 13 years old. We lived in a rented house, in my recollection, on 19th Street in the part of Brooklyn that I guess would be considered Flatbush. And before that, we lived on Ocean Parkway and a few other places that I don't recall at all. I'm just told we moved to Flushing, Long Island in 1952 or 52, I think, and lived there until I went off to graduate school.
Well, we'll come back to that in due course. Can you tell us a little bit about what your father and your mother did? How were they employed, if they were, and what?
My dad was a high school administrator during all the time I was growing up. When I ended up moving out, he was principal or assistant principal at a high school in Brooklyn, Tilden High School. He had started there back in the Depression, teaching accounting, which is what his college degree was in. And he rose up through the ranks. I think he was dean of students, and he had a few other administrative roles. But he was basically a high school administrator. One of the interesting things that he had done was he teamed up with another gentleman in the New York area that lived around the corner from us, who owned about a dozen nursing homes in the New York area. And my dad used to do business advising during weekends to sort of supplement the income.
This is while he was still acting as a high school administrator?
Yes.
Okay.
His background was in accounting, and he was really good at sort of analyzing the economic efficiencies of businesses. And so he would supplement his income, which was not that large in the school system, but was steady income, I guess, which was important during the Depression. And he used to supplement that by consulting with different businesses, a bakery that was marginal, and he'd explain how if you rerouted the trucks, you could save money, deliver more bread. If you organized your accounting this way, if you made people consultants rather than employees, if you took out one plan versus another, you could make it more efficient. And he used to do that with some regularity. So he teamed up with this gentleman whose name was William Kellman, and my dad worked with him to set up a system to help him manage his nursing homes. He was having trouble even figuring out who his patients were, what supplies they had, provisioning for the future, the sort of thing that you really need to do to stay on top of your business. And they set up a paper forms system of managing nursing homes. And they started to use it, and it turned out to make a big difference. So Bill Kellman, who was really the person who knew that business well, introduced that to some of his colleagues in Connecticut and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, some of the nearby states. And it didn't take very long before they were in all 48 states of the United States. Of course, later on it was all 50 states when Arizona and Hawaii came in late in the 50s. So this was all in the late 40s, early 50 time frame that happened. The company was called Macrobiotics, which was a name that didn't mean anything, I believe, back then. It later came to mean a significant amount, especially in the dietary regimes.
Sure.
But it was a little business that they grew significantly. When Medicare came about in the early 1960s, one of the things that they were in possession of was probably the most comprehensive list of nursing homes and names of administrators of those nursing homes and number of beds and much of the information that the government wanted. They made that available to the government because they were the only ones that really had it. The government, of course, set up a system of requirements for reporting that applied to both hospitals and nursing homes. They were not in the hospital business. That was sort of a too big business, but the nursing home was a little niche business. And they focused on that for their whole existence, and it turned out to be a small but very profitable little business. I don't think they ever did more than $1 million worth of gross revenue, but the profitability was huge. And my dad ran that business until the day he died.
That's amazing.
At age, I think he was 89 or 90, and he was still running it at that time. I've actually kept the business going. It's sort of a one-person business right now. It's really small, but it's sort of like a government bond that keeps producing a small percentage of revenue. So.
That's fascinating. Some things have a life of their own, don't they? What about your mother?
My mother was a very interesting woman, very interested in education, very socially minded. She was always trying to help folks, but in her 30s, she had the first of what would have been, I guess, a total of 8 heart attacks.
Good grief.
She apparently had rheumatic fever as a child, and it really came to pass. And the last of those heart attacks was so bad that the doctors told her that she would not survive another one. And they were coming at a frequency of about 1 a year. And so she ended up going in for closed heart surgery in 1953. Shortly after we had moved to Flushing. Closed heart surgery is a very different kind of surgery than open heart surgery, because with the open heart surgery, they can keep the blood circulating in the body and they have more time to do the operation. In closed heart surgery, which they had to do back then because they didn't have those machines, they literally had to shut down the blood supply. I mean, so they stopped the heart, they stopped the blood flow, and the brain can't be in 5 minutes, you're dead. And in fact, I think they said after 90 seconds, you start to suffer
some side effects,
some lossage in the brain, you lose certain functions. So they literally set a budget of, like 90 seconds or maybe 60 seconds to literally do the whole surgery. So they could get you prepared for it, but by the time they go in and do the surgery, and this was valve replacement, or I guess in those days that wasn't replacement, it was the mitral valve had closed due to scar tissue being formed, so they had to go in and cut out the scar tissue.
That's incredible they could do that in such a short amount of time.
And I didn't actually see the operation, but I'm told they did it with little X-Acto knives, those little things the model airplane guys use to cut balsa wood, little knives in the end of their finger. They sort of go in, do the surgery, and then they have to get it all cleaned out, because even a small piece of detritus in that system can cause blockages and strokes and the like.
Sure.
The mortality rate, I am told, the week of that operation was 50%.
Good God.
That is, you had a 1 chance in 2 of surviving the surgery that week, and that the mortality rate was 95% in 5 years. So you didn't go through the surgery unless those were good odds.
There weren't any other choices.
So she did, and not only did she survive it, although the first 5 or 10 years were really very difficult. I mean, she was bedridden almost the whole time. Of course, she had been bedridden for the 8 years or so before. She finally came out of it. She actually lived until she was 80 years old. She died in 1994 after having gone through the third. So she went through a second heart surgery in 1982, New York Hospital. That was open heart surgery, and by comparison, a piece of cake. Not that that's pretty invasive surgery, but that was actually valve replacement. And then she went through the same operation again in 1994, and she actually came out of the surgery okay, but there was so much damage to the heart muscle it couldn't continue to pump on its own. So she never actually made it out of the hospital. So that was unfortunate. But I do remember her saying that, or my dad relating to me that the first of her heart attacks occurred on April the 12th of 1945, which is a significant date because apparently she heard about Roosevelt's death on the radio and immediately went into heart failure after that. So it must have been just enough to trigger her over the top. So growing up as a kid, you know, my sister and I have one sister, Diana, who lives in Cleveland with her husband Harris. They had no, my parents really weren't able to deal with the house. My dad was busy with the work and caring for my mother. And my sister and I actually had the run of the household growing up as kids. So this was rather an unusual childhood. You're making dinner every night for your parents and things like that. I wouldn't say we did it all the time. And eventually my mother got into a form where she could actually take over and do that stuff. But it was an interesting childhood. She was actually an extremely bright woman, but you know, I think she was required to go out and work when she was growing up to bring in income for the family. And so she never went to college. I think she always regretted that. And so in later life, she actually went back to college to get degrees of one sort or another. And I think the things that she was proudest of, other than her kids and her grandkids, was the fact that she successfully got through all the college courses later in life. So here she was with, you know, teenagers, and here's a 70-year-old woman, you know, getting college degrees.
That's a great story. Now, you mentioned a sister. How many brothers and sisters do you have?
Just one sister.
Is she
Diana.
Younger or older?
She's about 2 years younger. Diana was a mathematician in her earlier days. She, I mean, things came pretty easy to me in school, and I think they did for her too, but she was probably competing with me at some level. So every time I would go out and get, you know, a 98, she'd get a 99 in the same course, and every time I'd get a 99, she'd have to get 100, whatever it took, and she would do that. And I don't think it was obsessive. I think it was just innate that, you know, and she ended up getting one of the best records I've ever seen. She graduated valedictorian from her high school, a class of, you know, same one I graduated from. I was probably 8th or something in the class. I don't even remember anymore, but she was first. And when she went to college, she went to Queens College. And she graduated first at Queens College, and then she went to the University of Chicago and got a PhD in mathematics. But she ended up getting more interested in health-related issues. She came down with diabetes in her 20s, type 1 diabetes, which they claim...
That's unusually late to show symptoms.
For type 1, you know?
Yeah.
So this could be, you know, typically caused by a virus or something like that. Bottom line was, somehow she lost interest in mathematics, although one of her son ended up getting a PhD from MIT in math, and so the legacy follows on, and he married a woman who got a PhD in mathematics, so she's got two kids that are mathematicians.
We'll probably come back to that for a couple of reasons, not the least being the research work that you did at Princeton, because that had a strong mathematical flavor to it too. But I wanted to ask you about some other relatives. You have another relative named Herman Kahn, but I don't remember exactly what the relationship is. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I met Herman only twice in my life. And I remember both times because when I introduced myself to him, he sort of got very flustered, and I wasn't sure why. But Herman was at the Rand Corporation for many years, and he wrote some of those famous books on thermonuclear war was one. I think Thinking About the Unthinkable was another one. Many people thought he was the caricature for Dr. Strangelove. Very heavy-set guy, overweight. He was in my dad's generation, and so that would make him probably some kind of second cousin, once or twice removed. And I don't remember exactly how they related, but I think his father was the brother of my father's father. if you can figure out the connections.
What
that's
the,
how
what
we-
the, yes.
So he was sort of not in the main line of the family, but he was sort of one or two removed over to the side.
It makes him a cousin of some kind or other, and that only women with the right DNA know how to figure out what that computation
I guess
is,
they
I
can
think.
relate to that. But I only saw him twice in my life. I don't think I ever had a really serious conversation. The twice I saw him, once was when he gave a talk up at MIT. I was in the audience and I asked him a question. And the other one when I was at DARPA, and he showed up there one day and shook his hand and mentioned that I was a distant relative, and he said, "Okay, nice to meet you," and then walked off. So I mean, I never had a substantive conversation with him.
It sounds a lot like my interactions with Vint Cerf.
Your son?
No, the other one.
Oh.
Let's move to a slightly different topic. You
But
talked
there was
about,
actually another relative in my family.
Oh, who did I miss?
Who has got a very interesting career. His name was Moe Berg, and if you ever heard of the book by J.D. Salinger called Catcher in the Rye?
Yes.
They wrote a book about Moe Berg. It was called The Catcher Was a Spy.
Oh.
And if you've been reading the Washington Post the last few weeks, they've had a comic series on him. So this is how well known he was. My wife Patrice has been, clipping it out, keeping track of it. Moe Berg, he was never married. Very interesting and perhaps introverted kind of fellow. Again, I never met him, but he's on my mother's side of the family, whereas Herman Kahn was on my dad's side. And he ended up becoming a lawyer, and he worked to go through law school by being a catcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers, among other things. And and I think he joined some other, I think he may have been with the Washington Senators or some other teams. And he caught all the All-Star games. So he was well known in baseball circles. I forget, he got a degree at either Columbia or the Sorbonne. And he became fluent in languages. So in fact, it's anecdotally said, since I never met him, I couldn't verify this directly, that he spoke or was fluent in something like 27 languages.
Good heavens.
Of which some number he was so fluent in you could not tell the difference between him and a native. I mean, he knew all the idioms and the expressions and the lore and the history and the like. He was recruited into the U.S. government during the Second World War to assist with some translation effects. There was a play that was recently put on that you may have seen called Copenhagen, very well known. It was all about a meeting between Werner Heisenberg, who was then in charge of Hitler's atomic energy program, I guess, trying to build bombs for Hitler, and his thesis advisor, who was Niels Bohr, famous atomic physicist. And the whole play is about just those three. I mean, it was Bohr, Heisenberg, and Bohr's wife. And he had gone there purportedly to find out something or talk with him, and they gave you three quantum mechanical views of this little interaction. Like, was he there to find out from Bohr what he knew about the Americans' plans? Was he there because he couldn't really make research progress without consulting his advisor? Was he there to try and convince Bohr that if the Americans would stop, then they would stop? I mean, there were all these different competing views. And of course, it leaves the end ambiguous, obviously. Well, Moe Berg was sent over, and it's reported in this book called The Catcher Was a Spy, was sent over to Germany during the Second World War with the ostensible purpose, I think, of assassinating Heisenberg.
Oh my gosh.
And again, I don't know the details firsthand, but apparently he managed to get close enough to him. I don't know whether it was a dinner or whatever, and he was probably armed with, a pistol and a cyanide tablet or whatever. But he came back, with the clear impression that Heisenberg was not a supporter of Hitler getting the bomb for whatever reason.
So the speculation might be that Heisenberg actually was impeding progress somehow,
Well, you could make that. I mean, I don't know what the rationale was. I've heard people say that it was reported that somebody who was a paranoid fanatic really shouldn't have access to atomic and nuclear weapons, or things like that. And so he made the decision not to carry out the threat and came back and reported why. And who knows what I mean, apparently it was a reasonable decision because he never really got those weapons. But that book was all about it. And so that's another part of the family.
That's fascinating. Let's move back to your childhood for a bit. Did you ever think much when that you can remember now as a young person about what you would do when you grew up?
You know, my childhood was a pretty happy childhood. We were pretty much in charge of some things, and my parents were very understanding. I mean, they were great people. I mean, I really related to them very well. And I don't recall ever having really serious thoughts about the future when I was a kid growing up, because it was just a very happy and comfortable arrangement. You know, despite the fact that my mother was not well, she was there. You know, you could talk to her, they cared. And I was sort of mainly doing what I liked to do, which was often, you know, go out and play ball with the kids in the street and get on my bike and ride and doing things that kids do. I had a very sort of normal childhood, I think, growing up, although my dad would tell me I was sort of ornery at times, you know, like they would go out for the evening sometimes and, you know, they'd come back and I would hide from the babysitter. Couldn't find me, and they'd all go into a panic, you know, I'd be hiding in the laundry hamper or some such thing.
You had mentioned that for a while you and your sister were preparing meals for your parents, which is an inversion.
Well, for the family.
For the family, I should say. An inversion, but I know that you have a great deal of interest in culinary things, and you're very good at it. Do you think that stems in part from your exposure early on to cooking?
I think probably not. I just think I developed a taste for food later on in life that probably did that. I think the mechanics of working in a kitchen, maybe I kind of learned
There's a certain comfort level with familiarity there.
But you have to remember, I mean, we didn't have Cuisinarts and all of the fancy gadgets that you might have today, you know, convection microwave ovens. I mean, you just didn't have that. So you had, you know, a frying pan and a pot, and, you know, it's just pretty basic. You know, cook a hamburger, you know, cook a chicken, boil a potato. That sort of stuff was sort of what we did. So I wouldn't call this, you know, high cuisine back then. Who knows? I mean, what things trigger you later in life?
Did you have any idols when you were growing up, people that you wanted to emulate or you looked up to or thought that somehow influenced your thinking?
You know, I was so into myself and the family that the main influences in my life growing up were my parents. You know, my mother was clearly a spiritual influence in the family because her spirit was sort of very dominant. But my dad was sort of the pillar in the family, and he was just making the family work, you know. And I guess to the extent that there's anybody that I looked up to, it was my dad. I mean, as a dean of students, he'd come home at night sometimes and tell us about all the crazy things that happened at school. This kid that threw the telephone through the window, and this kid that was, you know, plugging up the toilets and creating channels down the high school corridors. And I kept thinking, why do people do that? That's sort of silly, but I think as close to anybody, it would have to be my dad.
What about computers? Now, computers weren't around all that much. I know you were born in 1938, so by the time you would have been 13, it would be 1951. There weren't too many things around, maybe UNIVAC. When did you first have any exposure at all to computers?
Well, my background actually was more applied mathematics and communications. Mm-hmm. So I really didn't think of myself as being in the computer or computing field until I started to work on computer networks. That was sort of where I really felt close to computers for the first time. My first interaction with a computer was probably in graduate school at Princeton. That may be wrong. I'm trying to recall. It was with one of those early IBM machines where you had to toggle the switches.
Oh my goodness.
And it was just sort of learning what a computer was. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, not any serious use. I guess the first really serious interaction that I had with computers was at Bell Laboratories. So the first job I had after graduating from college was at Bell Labs. And I worked at the the headquarters of Bell Labs, you probably want to get into this later, but let me just fast forward since you asked the question now. And I was in an office that had 6 people in it. So it was a very big room with 6 desks. Pretty impressive people. And one of the people I shared the office with was a woman named Jeannie Root, R-O-O-T, and her job was to build some of the computing infrastructure for all of Bell Labs.
Wow.
I was working in the headquarters building of Bell Labs, which in 1960 was at 463 West Street in New York, right on the Hudson River. This was before Homedale had even been built. And most of the technical staff was at Murray Hill. But we were in New York at West Street, and Jeannie was busily trying to figure out how to bring onto the IBM 704, which is what we were using. This was not even a solid-state machine, as I recall. I think it was a vacuum tube machine. The ability to program in Fortran as well as
machine language
machine code,
yeah.
which I guess was FAP or something. There was some combination of machine code and Fortran, so you could write.
Well, we might have been assembly language by that time.
I think FAP was the Fortran assembly code of some sort. I'm recollecting. It was her job, it wasn't mine, but that was my first experience with the availability of that. And of course, one of my tasks back then was to actually evaluate certain switching capabilities that were being developed at Bell Labs, including some ferrite core switches, and looking at the materials properties of them and figure out what their failure rates were. And I ended up writing Monte Carlo simulation programs in some combination of Fortran and machine code to try and do the analysis. So that was both my first experience. I never actually saw the machines except through glass windows because they were, all
the fishbowl.
And we of course were programming on pads and punch decks, and one day later you get the printout back and edit it and go through all of the iterations that later were made unnecessary by moving to interactive time-sharing kinds of systems.
I'm sure people who grow up, online on the internet today have absolutely no concept of what it was like with pigeonholes, with printouts and punch cards. Where did you go to college, Bob? And is there a particular reason why you chose one place or another?
Well, I started at Queens College in New York. I had actually applied to about a half a dozen other schools. And the reason, and I believe I was accepted at most of them, if not all of them, but the reason I went to Queens College was because of family issues with the situation with my mother, which still hadn't been resolved. We didn't have much money in the family at the time. The city college, Queens College system hadn't been merged yet, but it was basically free by comparison. So for that combination of factors, I just decided to stay local, be with the family, and it was economic for us as well. So they had a program, an engineering program, where you could spend 2 years at Queens College taking all of the liberal arts, mathematics type of stuff, and then shifting over to City College, which was, of course, up at 139th Street in Manhattan. And so I spent 2 years at Queens College and then shifted over and finished the rest of the program. It was, I think, a 5-year program. So it was 2 years followed by 3, and I graduated in 4.5, so I graduated actually in January of 1960. I think the coursework finished in December of '59.
And what degree did you, after this 5-year program, this was a bachelor's degree in mathematics? Or
electrical engineering. So the degree was actually what's called a BEE degree, and it was a fairly broad-ranging program. City College, the whole system had really a wonderful educational program. It was geared toward, people in the city, mostly middle-class kids, which is what we were growing up. But it was a wonderful educational program. I mean, how many people do you know that have ever had experience in large power equipment? I mean, we used to go in on, I think it was Thursdays, in the grubbiest clothes we could muster, because we had to hook up these big power engines to power consumers, and we were carrying cables on our shoulders that must have been 3 or 4 inches in diameter, and you could barely drag the cables. I mean, it felt like elephant trunks that you were carrying around. and you'd hook them up, and you'd have to be careful because it'd be like 1,000 amps or huge amounts of current flowing, and you'd learn how to characterize the performance of a squirrel cage motor and a Prony brake and all that stuff. I mean, today you don't have any need for it, but back then this was what the field was like. So it was a really good background. I mean, we learned about transistors by testing them one at a time. Nobody today would ever even be able to get a transistor to test or think that it was necessary to learn, but back then this was brand new stuff. The whole semiconductor world had only been created in the late 40s at Bell Labs, and so by the middle 50s you were looking at these sickle case transistors, with the 3 spidery legs coming down, and you'd actually go through all the mapping of the currents and the voltages and the biases. It was really a very good education.
These were discrete components, in effect.
Discrete components. And the experience there was, about what you'd expect. I mean, most people commuted by train. It wasn't a big dormitory system. It wasn't like a college campus of the type you might find at a place like Stanford, where you spend some time, or any typical university that's campus type setting. There was a campus there, but it was more for commuting students. And so there wasn't much of a social life there after hours, and certainly not before hours. And bottom line, it was a very functional education. Well-trained people. I think they had some really good folks come out of there. In fact, I've been up there in recent years, and one of the people who's there a lot is Colin Powell, who explains how that's how he got his education. And
well, now that you've mentioned Colin Powell, were there other contemporaries that you recall that might be notable, maybe in our field?
Well, in our field, I know Len Kleinrock graduated from there a number of years before. I don't remember exactly how many. In my class, and again, I'm talking about the class of 1960. People you might know. There's a fellow named Andy Grove, who was a refugee from Hungary,
if I remember right. Yeah.
With this thick, syrupy Hungarian accent. I think he was a chemical engineer at the time, and I guess they just named the school after him because he made a sizable donation. But there were a number of really well-known people that came out of that because the education was really first rate, I think.
Now, after you finished your undergraduate work at CCNY, did you go immediately to graduate work? And if you did, where?
No, I didn't. I actually thought, I was sort of young going through the college. I think I went into college at age 16 and I got out when I was 20 roughly, plus or minus a year one way or another. And I thought maybe I ought to go out and get some job experience first, just find out what a real world setting was like. So I applied to a number of places, and I ended up taking a job at Bell Labs, which was in the New York area, as I mentioned. And I ended up choosing a job. There were several opportunities. Most of the people in my field went into what were considered the sexier parts of the field, like color television, which was just emerging. Some people went into modulation kind of theory work. Some went into, advanced materials kinds of stuff. I opted to join what was essentially an operations research department, which in part was sort of mathematically oriented. This was a group that was responsible for sort of the toll traffic engineering of the Bell system. Where do you put the lines, and how do you decide what switches go where? And I mean, it wasn't about the hardcore implementation of any piece of equipment, but it was sort of, how do you system engineer this thing to meet customer needs? And the gentleman who ran that division was one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. He was a very consummate professional. Reminded me of Walter Cronkite. I mean,
wow.
He came in with cardigan jackets and he smoked a pipe, and he was sort of a mathematician of sorts, but I mean, he would draw curves and intersections and figure out, well, I think we need about this many of that there because this is where the intersection goes. And he was figuring out what the curves, and he really developed all the toll traffic engineering theories, as far as I know, for the Bell system. He's probably the last person that understood where everything was in the Bell system. His name was Roger Wilkinson. He lived somewhere up in the Larchmont area, and I know he would go sail his boats every weekend. He was just a very stylish gentleman. And he ran a group of practitioners, mainly mathematicians. You may have heard some of them. John Reardon was a well-known mathematician, wrote some books on combinatorial theory, was in that group, worked for him. Walter Helly, who was well-known for toll traffic engineering theories, some interesting analyses of traffic through the tunnels, based on queuing theory. We had a fellow named Fred Desclous there. Fred later went to Belcourt after the breakup and was one of their well-known mathematical types. I actually worked most closely with a fellow named Joe Weber there. Joe had a long and distinguished career in the Bell system. And one of the people that I got to know very well in that time was a young lady whose maiden name I can't remember, but her name was Gigi, and she later married Dave Farber. So
that Gigi, I'll be darned.
People think that, that because I've had a long relationship with Dave over many years, that I knew Gigi because she was spouse, but the reality is I knew Gigi before I knew Dave.
I didn't realize that. That's fascinating. Wasn't there a fellow at Bell Labs who was a connoisseur of wine, and didn't you get introduced to some pretty spectacular vintages while you were there?
Yes, you know me well. We had a little luncheon group because we were working at West Street. It was right on the boundary of Greenwich Village, and there were all of these little boutique restaurants. I mean, these were not big restaurants a la today's mega style restaurants. I think it's a little excellent holes in the wall, places you had to know where they were. You go down some 3 stairs down in the back, and we used to go out for lunch every day. It was a group that consisted of myself, Joe Weber, a fellow named Dick Priest, who was the wine connoisseur, and sometimes the fourth one varied, but Peter Linhart was principally the fourth. Sometimes Gigi would join us and so forth. Dick Priest was a very unusual fellow. I have not seen him. I didn't see him before. I haven't seen him since that experience. He seemed to have 3 main interests in life, one of which was wine collecting, one of which was first editions, and I'm not sure of what exactly, and the third was opera. Those were the 3 things he seemed to care.
I hope he was interested in wine consuming as well as collecting.
Well, I can certainly vouch for the fact that he consumed it at lunch, but so did we with him. And so he had this big cellar that he kept. I believe it wasn't in his house. It was at some wine store on Madison Avenue that purchased it and apparently kept it for him. And he had this just enormous collection, apparently, of wine. And so what he offered to do was to bring in a different bottle of wine every day. These were all French wines. It was nothing but French. It was thoroughbred French. Every day he'd bring in a different bottle of wine, and we'd reimburse him for his cost of the wine. So
Cost? Yeah.
What he paid for it when he first bought it.
Okay.
So, who do you know in a 20 or a 30-day run of lunches would start out with Lafitte Rothschild 1928, followed by Lafitte Rothschild 1929, followed by Lafitte Rothschild 1930, followed by, and so we'd do a run on that brand, and he'd come in with running commentaries, that's where I learned all of the words, about nose and bouquet and, nutty and fruit, all of the words that would apply, and he'd give us running commentary, and, I was sort of making notes, but, it's very hard to go out and buy a good bottle of 1931 Lafitte Rothschild these days. So it doesn't do me much good. But and then we go on to the Chateau Margaux and the Chateau Bachevilles and the whatever it was. We just went through all of them, and it was a marvelous experience in learning about wine. And it was only one bottle, and there were 4 of us. So it wasn't like we couldn't function in the afternoon. But it was a really good experience.
What an incredible experience at a rather early age.
And one of the restaurants I really liked the best was a little one called the Beatrice Inn, which was, you probably wouldn't normally think about it, but there's a company called the Beatrice Foods Company that has all kinds of brands underneath. I can't even name what they are, but you'd probably recognize all of them as household names. Well, apparently their family owned a little tiny restaurant in the New York area. It was called the Beatrice Inn. And that was my mother's name, so I kind of had an affinity for it.
Fascinating. So, Bob, let's go back. Now, we were just talking about Bell Labs, but let's go back now for a moment to your graduate work, because after Bell Labs, I take it that you went to Princeton. And I'm interested to know a little bit more about what you chose to study there and why.
While I was at Bell Labs, I had applied for an NSF fellowship, and it came in sometime that summer, and it was applicable, I think, at any school of my choice. And I had applied to Princeton, and I'd gotten accepted there. I chose to go to Princeton for several reasons. One was it was reasonably close to home, so I could still imagine driving back home on weekends or at least monthly, so I didn't get too detached from my family, because they still were in need of some kind of iteration of help, and sometimes my dad would just need me there for some reason, help with my mother or something. Second, because it represented a change of style that was something that appealed to me. I mean, Princeton was a much more, it was sort of the inverse of City College in just about every way you can imagine. It wasn't in a big city, it was in a little town. It had a nice campus. It also had a nice golf course, right beside it, which is a whole other story I'll mention in a moment. But it was a much more social school, and I kind of felt like I could have used a little more training in the social graces. I wasn't used to wearing tuxedos all the time and just doing the kind of things that a good social environment can sometimes bring out. So while I was at Princeton, I actually, volunteered and became in charge of all the social affairs at the graduate school. So I would, set up all of the cultural events. Would set up all of the social events. I mean, I used to invite all the girls' schools to come down, from whether it was, Wellesley or Vassar or Bryn Mawr or whatever, and I'd be the host. There'd be a counterpart on the women's side, and we'd arrange all the, the social events that took place. That was something, there was no counterpart for that at City College at all. I mean, it just didn't happen.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. You'll have to edit this out. Do we need to ask them not to talk? Are we going to pick up a lot of that conversation?
Mike, I'm going to.
Let's continue now with the discussion about your time at Princeton. You were talking about being in charge of the social and cultural events. Do I remember correctly, Bob, that you were required to wear academic robes at certain times while you were at school?
Dinner in the graduate school was served in Proctor Hall, which was a very long, English-looking venue, and yes, we had to wear academic robes to dinner, and we had to say the appropriate graces. That's where I learned how to say appropriate Latin graces, because sometimes I had to actually say it. Pro pana aquae poto omnibusque vitae beneficis, and so
you weren't required to go through the in nomine Domini et Patris et Filius Sanctus and all that. No,
was,
okay. So
bread
it
on
so
our
it
table,
was.
and you give thanks for the food that. And it was a very interesting event. Every night. Of course, most of the graduate students were there in jeans and T-shirts underneath these academic robes. So it was, and of course, the big problem was these robes had big long tails on the sides, and everything they seemed to serve for dinner had gravy. And so the biggest problem was getting gravy on your sleeves, and so you'd learn to push the things like that. Those are interesting times. And of course, I ran a pretty frenetic kind of existence compared to most students, because I kind of learned to function for part of my time there on 3 chunks of 2 hours sleep. So I was getting 6 hours sleep a night in 3 2-hour chunks. So I'd get up at 6 in the morning, and I'd head over to Baker Rink to do my figure skating patches. And then I'd come back and get showered, go off to school, and at noon I'd come back and we'd have lunch, and I'd go to sleep for 2 hours, like from 12:30 to 2:30. Get up at 2:30, head back to the engineering school, work until 6:30, come back, and dinner was like 7 to 7:30, and then I'd go to sleep from 7:30 to 9:30. Then get up and work until 4 in the morning, go to sleep for 2 more hours, and get up at 6 and go do my figure skating patches. So, I mean, that was, and the funny part of it was that, you know, you'd think you'd be tired all the time, but I wasn't. I was revved up all the time. It was sort of like, you know, you don't feel like you've been out for 8 hours and you got to sort of get started up and get a coffee into the system. You kind of wake up and you're going full board. So it was really a very good existence. I can't do it anymore.
I remember going through a similar period of time when it was the only way to get a lot done. It was you slept, you got the same number of hours of sleep, but you broke it up so you could almost work 24 hours a day. It's terrific practice. Well, you mentioned ice skating, figure skating. Is this when you picked up an interest in golf as well?
Actually, I had never played golf until I was in high school. My dad had an old set of clubs at home, and he used to go out occasionally play. Those were the old wooden shafted clubs, you know, hickory shafts. And after we moved to Flushing, I had a friend, Jeffrey Rothman, and he lived a few blocks away, and we were probably a mile or two from school, so we used to walk it every morning and come back at night. It was just two of us as high school kids. I was, I guess, a junior at the time. I started in high school in Brooklyn at Madison, and then for my junior and senior year, we had moved out to Flushing, Long Island. And it turns out Jeff was a golfer. He was actually a pretty good golfer. And I sort of knew that, but it didn't really get into my inner thinking because it wasn't something I did. And then one day he said he was going to be a little late. Could I meet him at such and such a room, which I did. And it turned out it was meeting of the golf team. And he came out a few minutes later and basically said to me, could I join them inside? Well, it turned out that they had only 4 people that had shown up, and you needed 5 people to constitute the golf team. And so he asked if they could use my name on the golf team in order to just have a roster. And he said, you know, we'll get somebody else. And I said, you have to realize I've never played the sport, don't know anything about it. And he said, it's all right. He says, we'll find someone else. Bottom line, they didn't find anybody else. It came the first match, and I was the 5th man on the team. And believe it or not, I actually had something like a 1-8 record that first year. I actually won a match because some other golf team had somebody else in the same situation. And the second year, I liked it enough, you know, that I went out for it again. This time I made the golf team on merit, I guess. Although maybe only 5 showed up again, I'm not really sure. And I think I had a 5-4 record the second year. So, and then when I got into college, I went out for the varsity golf team and actually made the college golf team. I was getting pretty good at that time, and we played some of our matches on the black course at Bethpage, where they just held the U.S. Open in 2002. We played a lot of our golf at some of the area courses. I remember playing a match against Iona College at Winged Foot, where they played the U.S. Open this last year. They played it in 1959, and I think at that time, I think maybe Billy Casper won the Open that year. But we played it on the Monday right after the Open ended. So it was literally the U.S. Open setup. They hadn't changed the pins. The rough was even a little higher. And if you've ever played U.S. Open style golf, you know that it's not like regular golf, because in regular golf, if you're a little off the fairway, you just play the ball out of the rough. But for the Open, they put a premium on accuracy. And so when the rough is that high and your ball gets into it, it's like hitting out a steel wool. I mean, you're lucky if you can get it back on the fairway. And so you can be 2 inches off the fairway, and it's essentially half a stroke or a stroke penalty. I shot one of the best rounds of golf I had ever played in my life. I was hitting everything as well as I knew how. I wasn't that accurate, and I shot a 92. And I said, if that's the best I can do, top of my game, these guys are pretty good. And so that was my one calibration with, you know, Premier of Golf. It put me in my place. I knew where I was, and just being good isn't enough to compete in that league. So I began to appreciate golfers like Jack Nicklaus and others in later years much more than I would have thought I would as a young kid.
I know you've been a great and avid golf player, and I thought it was pretty neat when you got the Presidential Medal of Freedom and you got to have a picture with Jack Nicklaus. I know that meant a lot to you, and it was fun to watch the enthusiasm. He's a really nice guy, isn't he?
Well, I enjoyed meeting him. I think he was. Well, you got a chance to meet him too. I did get a picture of him. In fact, I have it up on the wall. You know, one of the things that really struck me was that he was beginning to use the internet. So it seemed like a fair trade of some sort.
What would be nice, I suppose, would be to have a chance to play a game of golf or a round of golf with him. Maybe you should think about that.
Well, I don't know what would be in it for him exactly, so I think I won't propose it. But if I could shoot, like my one dream in life was to get on a golf course and shoot 18 birdies. Birdie every hole. So if I could figure out how to do that sometime, I'd be happy to play around a golf
It
with
sounds like you need a GPS receiver on the golf ball plus a gyroscopic control and a few
computer
other
program. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those fantasies that you
when we
play.
we
You play a really hard course in your mind, and you say, well, drive down the fairway, 2 feet from the hole, knock the putt in, do the same, and 18 holes later, you've got 18 under par, no problem.
Well, it seems
doesn't happen in practice.
when we talk about CNRI, we'll talk about microelectronic mechanical systems, and maybe there's a possibility of an 18-hole birdie. Well, let's come back for a moment to Princeton. Were there people who either Princeton or CCNY or Queens? Were there people that particularly influenced your thinking and your career while you were in college?
I would have to say yes. At City College, the person who most affected me and influenced me was a professor by the name of Egon Brenner, who's now retired, and I think he's in Florida. And he actually lived not too far from us in Queens and would often drive me either to school or back. So it was a very interesting opportunity for a student to get to know a faculty member, and I was just an undergraduate at the time. He later went on to become dean or provost at some of the other schools, so he had a career of his own. He wrote one of the outstanding textbooks in circuit theory with a fellow named Monsieur Javid. But I remember in the final year at City College, what Egon said, it was very, very observant of him. I was a student that had never really been motivated by school that much, because, the learning was just something I knew I could do, and homework was something you just had to do because they required it, and oftentimes I could just look at it and say, I know how to do all these projects and answer all these questions, but why do it? It's like doing a really easy crossword puzzle. I know I can fill in all the answers, but, do I have to bother? And so I was not that motivated. He came to me in my senior year and he said, we have a class here called Advanced Studies, and it can be anything we like. And he set that up, and the class consisted of the two of us. I was the only student. And the thing was really focused on trying to get me to think about doing research. So he would pose challenging problems for me to think about, maybe even unsolvable ones, I don't know. And I can't tell you any specific thing we did, but I remember that whole experience was one of, for the first time, really forcing me to dig deeper and try and figure out how to solve problems for which there were no textbooks.
There were no answers in the back of the book.
And no guidance as to how to even deal with that kind of a problem. And I think it stood me in very good stead. I think, he probably knew what was going on at the time better than I did, but I think in retrospect, I could really see that made a big difference to me in just sort of finding the inner core of who I was at a scientific basis. So that's at City. And at Princeton, I had really good collegial relationships with some of the students. Two of the faculty in particular. One was a fellow named Ken Stieglitz, who had just joined the faculty. In fact, I think Ken is still a professor at Princeton to this day. Very smart, very energized, really clever fellow, but a nice fellow too. I really enjoyed those interactions. And another professor who I believe is also still on the faculty named B.D. Liu, who had also joined. But those were more collegial, even though they were faculty and I was sort of a senior graduate student at the time. But my advisor was a gentleman named John Thomas. And John was more distant from me. And I don't think I really appreciated what John's contribution was at the time. I do now. Nor did I think he understood me very well, because I think I was probably the biggest surprise they ever had at Princeton. They didn't know what I might amount to, and because I was a pretty independent spirit. I'd go off and do my own thing, and I was, not part of the normal milieu of people who, paid due deference to. I was pretty much of an independent spirit, is the bottom line. And John's contributions were very structural. I mean, I believed at the time, and even more so now, that he could have advised anybody on any topic in any field. Because it almost, and that's not to say he didn't know a lot about the field, because he did, but he didn't inveigle himself into the middle of it. So he would say, okay, tell me about your progress in the last whatever period of time it was. So you described it, and he said, and what problems did you encounter? And what's your approach to solving them? And how are you going to deal with this thing that you're not sure how to deal with? And what things are you going to document? And I mean, he would sort of, by virtue of asking generic questions, cause you to form the plan for how you're going to deal with your stuff. I mean, never specifics. He would never say, go find a solution to this and get the answer to that and calculate this eigenvalue. And I mean, it would all be have you tell him what your plan was for dealing with it. And it was really pretty effective. John retired from Princeton sometime in the late 1990s, maybe 96 or something like that. I forget the exact date. And I went to his retirement party on the campus. He had a number of students, too, that were fairly well known. You probably know some of them. Eugene Wang was, I think, his first student.
Indeed, yes.
You probably know Steve Wolf was another one of his students. So he had a number of students that became fairly well known in our field. I was like student number 6. And John decided to introduce all of the students who were there one by one with a little bit of background on them. And when he got up to me, he said, Bob was always a challenge for us. He said, because he was always, I forget exactly how he phrased it, but I mean, a very nice introduction. But then he went on to say, and he probably doesn't know this, but he's the only graduate of our department that ever wrote 2 PhD theses.
And you didn't know that either.
Well, I didn't know that either. I mean, and what he meant by that was my PhD thesis was actually an A plus B thesis. It had sort of an A part on modulation and coding kinds of things, and it had a second part on sampling theory.
Okay.
And the reason it did was they had come to the conclusion, according to him, that I had done enough work for the PhD thesis in a few months, and that I just hadn't spent enough time in the program. So instead of having me continue down the path that I started out, because I had pretty much dealt with that problem, they reassigned me to work with B.D. Liu, who had just joined the faculty, and that relationship actually worked out pretty well, and together, it was more collegial, as I say. We ended up, pursuing a whole other area in sampling theory. And so, that's the reason why when it got packaged up together, it was sort of viewed as an A plus B package. They were very, very interesting, but very different kinds of things. For example, on the modulation problem, I was able to show that the most general form of modulation involves modulating the amplitude and the phase of amplitude and angle of signals. And I was able to show that if you specified one, the solution to the other was actually the solution to the Schrodinger wave equation. If you wanted to kind of compact the signal into the minimum bandwidth, and the question I kept asking myself is why would that come to play here? What is there about quantum mechanical things that would play in bandwidth compression and signal processing? But that was the end result of that, was just sort of that analysis. And we did a similar thing on the sampling side of the world to try and deal with what happens if you take multiple samples. Could you take a signal that was wiggling really very fast and sample it a lot slower and still be able to reproduce it, because you don't have the technology that'll sample it fast enough. And I was able to show that if you actually sampled it a lot slower, but you independently processed the samples, like you processed the signal and its derivatives and, different combinations of the signals that you could derive. You took the signal and put it through a lot of different filters, let's say, and then sampled slowly the output of all those different filters. You could then, for an appropriate choice of filters, namely they couldn't be all dependent linearly on each other, like they couldn't be identical, that wouldn't help. That you could actually exactly reconstruct the signal if it were appropriately band limited. So it was an interesting result, which I think probably has many applications, like if you're trying to build a high-speed oscilloscope today, and you can't make the electronics work fast enough. You could actually make the electronics work, like 1,000 times slower, and still be able to figure out what these signals look like. So it was another interesting contribution that I didn't really do more than just show the theory of. So the experience at Princeton was mainly a theoretical one. I mean, it was mainly, into physics and math and things like that. So I just tucked away in the back of my mind that I'd written 2 PhD theses. Okay, didn't know it, didn't even know he was thinking about that. In 1998, Harold Shapiro, who was then the president, awarded me an honorary degree from Princeton. And when I first got the notification, I said they made a mistake. They'd forgotten I already have a PhD from Princeton.
I already earned one,
They forgot, because I didn't think they actually gave honorary degrees to their own graduates. And they certainly rarely gave them in engineering in any event. It might have been one of the only ones they ever gave. So when he had his dinner the night before, he asked to say certain things about your experience at Princeton. And so I said, well, when I first heard about the honorary degree, I thought it must be a mistake. But then I remembered John Thomas saying that I'd written 2 PhD theses, so I thought it was only fitting that I got an honorary degree too.
It wasn't honorary, in fact. It was in recognition of the second one that you had to write.
I think it was honorary, and I think it was more in recognition of the internet as being a social contribution to society, not for the technical parts of it, but more for the impact that it had. The other thing that was really interesting at that particular dinner was I recounted my experience because on the golf course, because they had this wonderful golf course at Princeton. Springdale was right adjacent to the graduate school, so I could literally walk out. I could have played in academic robes if I wanted. But the summer after finishing all of the required coursework, classwork, I took very few classes at Princeton because it was mainly in that library that beautiful mind recorded John Nash as doing his stuff, and I was in there all the time reading books and doing a lot of studying. I took some classes, but a lot of work on my own. I took something like 4 or 5 months off and did nothing but play golf, just to transition between the infusion of knowledge and the writing of the thesis. So from roughly May of 1963, from May of 63, I guess, through maybe October of 63, I did nothing but play golf, 4 rounds a day.
Good.
Which is a lot because, a typical round today, many courses like 4 or 5 hours. I played with this other fellow student by the name of Stu Smith, and we could walk the course in parallel. We played ready golf in parallel, and we basically played the course about 2.5 hours. So we'd be on the course at 7 in the morning, 9:30 we'd be finished with the first round, back on the first tee. 12 o'clock, we're finished with round 2, and so we have a sandwich and, Coke, Stu, as gung-ho as I was, and we'd be back on the first tee at 12:30. 3 o'clock, we're done with round 3. And now we're tired because we're walking, carrying our own bag, and we lived that summer in a house on Battle Road, which is we had rented for the summer with some other students. It was right near the golf course, so went back there, went to sleep, took a shower, went to sleep for an hour or two. 5 o'clock, we're back on the first tee again. 7:30, we're done because it was summer hours. And we go out and do barbecue in the back or something, grill a steak, go to sleep and repeat it. And we did that, and that's when my game really got really good. That's where I really started to figure out how to get it down. So I was recounting at the dinner, this particular story, and I said, I know it's hard to believe, but that's what we did, and I've not seen or heard of Stu since. He's the only one that could vouch for that. At which point this hand goes up in the back of the audience. And he says, "Hi, Bob." And it turns out it's Stu Smith, who at that point was chairman of the physics department.
Oh my gosh.
So he was able to vouch for, what actually transpired.
That's absolutely terrific. What a great story. And how many people have gotten to play golf for 4 or 5 months straight? So you sort of retired early and then went back to work, I would have to say. We've sort of touched a little bit on your first job out of school, and that was at Bell Labs. After you finished at Princeton, and if I'm remembering right, your thesis was on rate distortion theory. Is that the correct term?
Well, it was called Some Problems in the Sampling and Modulation of Signals. It was about sampling signals and reconstructing them from samples. And this is a well-known theory. I mean, Claude Shannon and Nyquist did work on similar things.
Yes.
They showed if you sample a signal at twice its highest frequency,
you could always reproduce
you could reconstruct it exactly if it was band limited. And I generalized that to a general theory of how you could sample signals with multiple samples at different rates and the like. And then the other part was on the modulation one I described earlier. So I began to think about rate distortion theory when I was up at MIT, and I actually wrote one paper on the subject, but I really didn't stay with that very long, as you well know, because I got into networking fairly soon.
Actually, let's follow that now. So after you finished at Princeton, did you then go straight to MIT to teach?
Yeah, I did. I originally thought I might like to go to a small school. Again, my model was I don't function very well as a small fish in a very big pond. I mean, I'm too individualistic, I guess, or something like that. So I thought maybe a real small school would be the first choice, and I sent letters around, interviewed with some of them, and it turned out the more I looked at it, the more I realized this was a bad choice for me. There wasn't enough support structure. I mean, I'd be literally all on my own, and it'd be hard to really do anything. So I changed gears, and I think I sent 2 letters out very late in the game. This was like probably, in May or June of '64 when I was graduating. I sent one to Stanford, this little school on the West Coast, and one to MIT, this little school on the East Coast. And I got a polite letter back from Stanford, basically saying, sort of late in the game, everything has really been pinned down for the next year, but my application looked very interesting, and I'd be happy to consider me for the following year.
To which department did you submit it at Stanford?
That was probably electrical engineering.
Okay.
Remember, this was '64.
That was probably John Linville would have been the dean about that, or the chairman at that time.
It could have been John, yeah. That's probably, in fact, exactly who it was. And MIT sent me back a very interesting letter. This was from Peter Elias, who was in chair of the department. And he said virtually the same thing. It's late in the year, basically all their slots are filled. But on the other hand, they would be more than happy to invite me to come up and meet with some of the faculty and just get to know them and maybe give a seminar, which I did. And I came back, and sort of like 1 week later or 2 weeks later, there was a letter in the mail saying they had found some additional funding and were willing to offer me a forward postdoctoral fellowship, an assistant professor up at MIT, and so I decided to go do that. I mean, I don't know what I would have done if they had said
so
no.
this was electrical engineering also?
Electrical engineering. That was an interesting group because that incoming class included people like Mike Bertuzzo, who you probably know.
Yes.
I think Bob Cooper might have been in that class.
Oh my gosh, amazing.
You know, a few other people that we know well.
Mike ended up running the lab for computer science. And,
Right, he recently passed away.
Yes, and Cooper ran DARPA for a time.
Head of DARPA for a while.
That's fascinating. Now, there were, you were one of the youngest professors in the department, if I remember right.
Probably the youngest. I can't vouch for that, but I think it's probably the case. And it was rather interesting because I had basically been trained, even though it was electrical engineering in my background, and even though I got a pretty good training in the pragmatics of it at City College, my work at Princeton was largely theoretical. I mean, I took a lot of courses in applied math and physics. Most of the electrical engineering stuff I pretty much learned myself. I took some courses in it. But I was really an applied mathematician up there. And the courses that I was teaching, I taught the course in information theory for a while. I taught some of the courses in circuits and communications theory, things like that. But they were basically pretty mathematical, which is why I found electrical engineering so interesting in the first place. You know, when I first went into college, I thought maybe industrial engineering was what I would go into. And I very quickly decided that was not the right choice for me for a variety of reasons. And in fact, there was no program for that even at Queen. So I switched to chemical engineering. And I was in that for all of about 2 or 3 weeks when I decided I didn't like the lab work. So I switched to electrical and that kind of stuck. So that's principally what I was doing at MIT. And the faculty at MIT was pretty amazing faculty. They were all people who not only had established reputations in the field, but they seemed to have insights into things that I didn't have. And you know, it was really brought home to me one day when I had periodically been meeting with the gentleman who ran the group. His name was Jack Wozencraft. Jack is now retired, but he's living out in California or Oregon, someplace on the West Coast right now. But I really admired Jack Wozencraft. I really looked up to him. He just seemed to be smart about so many things, and I'd go in, and we had a very, good group at the time. I mean, Erwin Jacobs had one of the offices on the faculty. Claude Shannon was on the faculty. Bob Gallagher, Bob Bono. I mean, there were Harry Van Trees. There were a lot of very good people that were there and on that faculty at the time. And I was busily working my mathematical problems, and I'd go into Jack, with them, and I'd be working them on the board, trying to get his insights or whatever. And I would say every now and then he'd get animated, he'd get up on the board and start working with me. But more often than not, he would be, writing his papers, reading his book, and he'd listen. I mean, very politely, tolerate me being there. And finally, one day, I just said, "Do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" And I said, "Why is it that sometimes you get up on the board and you're really animated, and the other times I kind of feel like I'm interrupting?" He says, "No, you're not interrupting." He says, "I mean, I'm listening to you." And he says, the reason that I get animated is when I can see what the value is of what you're doing. If I know what to do with the results of your problem, I get real interested in it." He says, "If I can't figure out, so you get the eigenvalue to this equation, I don't know what to do with it. So, if I told you I knew the answer, what would you do with it?" And I said, "Well, I'm just trying to find out what it is." He says, "Well, that's the problem." He says, "I want to go a step further. I want to know why I'm trying to get the answer to the problem. And if I don't know why I'm trying to solve the problem, other than it's an interesting problem," he says, "I just don't get that interested." All right, well, that was a real insight for me, because that had never been part of my formulation of problems. I mean,
problems were interesting, and if they were interesting, you attacked them.
Well, I mean, it's like if somebody gave you a crossword puzzle to solve, and you started to work on it, and I said to you, "Why are you working on the crossword puzzle?" Probably the answer would be, "It's because I feel like it," or, just occupy myself for a while. But there was no larger answer for most of the problems that I was working on. And he said, it's basically experience. If you really want to understand how to deal with problems, you need to get some experience. And he said, I'll give you a list of people. I mean, if I were you, I'd go take a year, go take a leave of absence, apprentice yourself, figure out how to build something, and then come on back. So that's what I ended up doing. And one of the places he suggested I go visit was Lincoln Lab. My friend Paul Rosen was in running the communications division, and Erwin Lebo was his deputy, so I knew them both very well. In fact, Paul had been in my class as a student when I taught information theory, which was kind of interesting because Paul was a real good practitioner of the field, but he wasn't really a theoretician. And so every now and then when somebody would ask a question about, like, well, why would you want to do that? Paul would jump up and he'd have all the answers. So it was really very interesting. But Lincoln had, right after I had applied, been put on a freeze by the DOD. They literally shut off all the hiring. So I got this, I forget if it was a call or a letter from Erwin, who basically said, look, we'd love to have you come. He says, but right now we just can't hire anybody. We don't have any discretion on that. Well, the other place that Jack had suggested was BB&N. And
this is Bolt, Beranek, and Newman.
Bolt, Beranek, and Newman was a small architectural acoustics firm at the time in Cambridge, up in the Fresh Pond section, just north of Harvard. And he suggested I talk to Jordan Baruch, who I'm still very friendly with, and Jordan later became Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Productivity, Technology, and Innovation. He ran a big chunk of the Commerce Department. And we had very good discussion back then. It turns out at the time that I was looking at two things. The other possibility was the University of California at San Diego, which was just starting a EE department out there. And it turned out Erwin Jacobs was exactly thinking of leaving at the same time.
Wow.
And taking a leave of absence. And we were looking at the exact two same jobs. So I remember I was out in Hawaii in that year. It must have been the summer of 1966. And I was visiting Wes Peterson, who was one of the faculty members out there. And he asked me, he said, did you hear what Erwin decided to do? Because Erwin was about 2 or 3 months ahead of me in the decision process. And I said, no, I didn't. What did he? Because I knew whatever he decided, I was Pauli exclusion principle. I was going to do the other. I was going to have to do the other. So he said, Erwin decided to go to BB&N. So I said, well, I guess I'm going to move to California. And on the way back, I stopped at Stanford, and I was visiting Tom Kylath, who was then in the EE department. I think Tom may still be there, if he hasn't retired yet. And Tom said, hear what Erwin did, because Tom always knew everything that was happening before anybody else seemed to. And he said, did you hear what Erwin decided to do? I said, yeah, I understand he's going to BB&N. He said, no, he's going to San Diego. So between the one day and the next, somehow Erwin had apparently changed his mind, and I later was able to verify with him that after they decided to go to BBN, it was somehow torrential downpour that night, and I think Joan said, why don't we just go find someplace where the weather's a little better? And they just changed their mind overnight. So I ended up going to BB&N as a result.
Did Erwin actually wind up joining the University of San Diego, or California at San Diego, or did he go and start Winkabit
He became
right
a faculty member in the department.
Okay.
As far as I know. I went out to visit him in I think it was the winter, it was like a December or January of either 68 or 69, I'm not sure which, I think 68. And I was en route to some vacation out in that area, and I stopped by San Diego to visit him. But en route, I stopped in Los Angeles, and I had dinner with Kung Yao, who was a former student of John Thomas and was then on the faculty at UCLA. And Kung said, did you hear that Erwin, Andy Viterbi, and Len Kleinrock just started a little consulting firm called Linkabit? Turns out the company was an answering machine in Len's closet at the time. There wasn't much going on, but when I went down to visit Erwin, he sort of said, yeah, that's true, but how did you know? Because we just decided it a couple of days ago or something. So I gave him the story on that.
So, Bob, you had mentioned, I think, an important life lesson. When you had mentioned that Wozencraft saying that he was asking this question, well, why are you doing that? What's the motivation, and so on. Well, are there other kinds of life lessons that come to mind that over this, incredible time period of your career that you think are notable and worth sharing?
Well, on a personal level, I think clearly experiences I had with my mother's health as a young child told me how fragile things were. I sort of knew that right from the get-go. I don't think I had much appreciation of financial stuff when I was growing up. I think for two reasons. Number one, we didn't have any really serious financial resources back then, and therefore there was nothing much to worry about. I mean, because my dad had a fairly steady job, and it was just sort of, that's what life was like. But also, he was an accountant by background, and there was something about me that always has taken the position that if somebody else is doing something, I want to do something different. I want to be always doing the new thing, rather than adding on to some old thing, or that's part of didn't want to be a little fish in a big pond, because that's somebody else's big pond. And I think the fact that he was into that field sort of shied me away from it for a long time. And I later learned actually how important and interesting it was. That may sound strange, and I think the same is true about law. My wife, Patrice, is a lawyer, and I think she has shown me some of the more interesting aspects of law as intellectual domains. Particularly the copyright field, which she specializes in, how it's like this intricate tapestry. It's almost like this book, Gödel, Escher, and Bach showed how music could have certain mathematical patterns, and how art could have it in the Escher style. And you can see the same things in both accounting and law and the like, if you look at it the right way. So some of those were I wouldn't say they were lessons as much as sort of awarenesses. One of the most difficult things for me to deal with was, as a young kid, I had always believed that if you had a really good idea from a research perspective, that you ought to be able to get it out to the community. And I remember when we were doing the original ARPANET design, it had been mandated that we use Bell 303 modems. These were 50 kilobit modems that you could get from the Bell system. They hadn't really been propagated very much. It was brand new technology for the most part. And I know we're going to get into this topic later, but when I went to Bell Labs to sort of find out how they worked, I needed to know all the details about this network that we were building. I discovered that they had a working Bell 304 modem at Bell Laboratories. And the Bell 304 modem, unlike the 303, which was basically, a resistive capacitive thing, you'd pulse it and the circuit would die out, and you do it again, you could sort of tell which way the pulses were going. It was a trivial modem. The 304 modem was more complex. It used the same channel bandwidth, which was, I think, 48 kilobits, one of the nominal structured bands that Bell used to break it down into voice channels. And they built this modem with different signaling convention that would get 108 kilobits a second on the same channel. So I said, since we're paying for these channels, we should be using the Bell 304 modems, because it would give us more than double the capacity. And I couldn't convince Bell Labs or the Bell system to let us use it, because it wasn't a product on the market. And I said, well, but this is just a research experiment, so why can't we? They didn't want to inject it out because their business decision processes said that putting out something that would allow you to get more bandwidth on something, given the regulated environment in which they lived, was not as good a business strategy as requiring more inefficient modems to be used. So they didn't actually release it. It was, I don't think, ever released. And I struggled with it. I actually wrote a memo, saying, well, what's the purpose of research if it doesn't get out and you can't use it, at least for experimental? I mean, it was very troubling to me. I ran into almost the same problem many years later at DARPA when we were doing the packet satellite program. And At the time, there were no domestic satellites. This was maybe 1973 or something like that. But the only satellites we could actually access at the time were the military satellites, in particular the Discus satellites, or the Intelsat satellites. Those were the two options available to me at the time. And I remember dealing with the ComSat folks to try and get them to work with us on a protocol that would essentially make a single satellite channel work like an Ethernet in the sky. So that you could send a packet up and it would broadcast it, and the relevant ground station would pick it up based on identifiers in the signal and relay it to the appropriate parties. And they wouldn't go along with it because this amounted to a more efficient use of a resource that they had. And it turns out their money was based, I mean, I'm now inferring this, but their profitability was based on a fixed percentage of assets. So as far as they were concerned, putting up another satellite would give them a bigger asset base. They could bring in more money. So they didn't want to do it. They never said that in any letter. I mean, I never heard it in so many words, but I'm inferring that that was the motivation. So, but I was now armed with this because I had already learned this lesson once before. So I went to my friend Fred Bond, who then ran the Defense Satellite Office, which was part of DCA, I think, at the time. And he was in charge of the Discus satellite. He was in charge of all the satellite programs. And Fred said, fine, I'll be willing to give you some capacity on the Discus system for experimental purposes. So I wrote back to George Lawler, who was then the marketing manager of ComSat, who was handling this, and I said, you know, we found another approach. We don't need the ComSat satellites. And now suddenly, George was faced with the choice of not selling one channel versus N, because he was thinking you could, if we had like 5 satellite sites, that's 10 different bidirectional circuits.
Yeah, exactly. N squared over 2, roughly
squared
speaking.
over 2 bidirectional circuits. So versus 1. So he'd rather sell 20 than 1. But now he had the choice of 1 versus 0. And what was worse was, and I think this was the beginning of my learning how to invoke some political skills here, I simply pointed out to him that I had discovered that the authorizing legislation for Intelsat basically allowed the DoD to go directly to Intelsat if they wanted. They didn't actually have to go through ComSat in order to get channels, if it was a matter of national security. And I said that if push came to shove, we would invoke that instead of having to work through ComSat. So I thanked him for his help, appreciated all of it, understood where they were coming from, and we were going to go a different way. One day later, there's a call from George. They've reevaluated the whole situation. They're now willing to work with us, and so that was a lesson that I learned, and then I saw directly applied. And I've seen several others. I guess the other major one that I would point to is that when you are running a program that for the first time gets a lot of money in it, discretionary money, that the sharks will come out of the water from every direction and try and take a bite out of it. And I think we saw that in strategic computing in spades. Now, I sort of knew that, but I actually saw it, directly happen. I think I also learned one other lesson when I started CNRI, and I know we're getting ahead of the story here, but when I started CNRI, I really thought that there was a need for this country to invest in infrastructure, information infrastructure in particular. And I thought the idea was so compelling that industry would just sort of jump in. And we should have no trouble getting 100 of the big industries to put in $1 million each, and that ought to be enough to get a program going DARPA style. Didn't happen. Didn't happen for many reasons, and I think it was the understanding of all the reasons why it didn't happen. It wasn't that the idea wasn't good. Hardly anybody said this was a bad idea. It's just that the government should do it rather than us. Or, they don't have that much money for discretionary funding outside, or they were willing to fund it inside but not out. And I think that really gave me a much better appreciation of what the pragmatic possibilities were for actually raising funds for, let's say, This wasn't totally altruistic because I knew this would help the business base, just like the internet wasn't altruistic either. It was a major contribution, but this was something that didn't fit anybody's immediate direct business need, and therefore it was very difficult to make the case that they ought to put in money external to the company when they could spend it internally on things that had more direct meaning and value to them. So that was another lesson that I learned.
This sounds like the what's in it for me problem, where in order to convince somebody to do something, you have to have an argument that is persuasive from their point of view as opposed to the one that persuaded you, which might be for different reasons.
What's that famous story they tell about, the salesman who walks out of somebody's house and somebody says, well, did you make the sale? And he said, no, I didn't make the sale because they didn't understand. Somebody said,
whoops.
Problem is,
You need to understand.
You didn't
Exactly.
understand how to make the sale.
Exactly. We're still in the sort of the pro forma section of this interview, Bob. So the next question is, what do you think your proudest moment was, or maybe their proudest moments, plural?
That's so difficult to question. And I think it has many different tentacles to it. And then the question is sort of, what are you feeling the pride about? Are you feeling pride about something that you did, or feeling pride about what somebody else did?
It's a loaded question in many respects. Well, it could be, maybe, I don't mean to distort the question necessarily, but things that were most satisfying would be another way of asking this.
Well, let me just first say something about the external part, because I don't think that's really where we want to linger, but I remember when my mother went in for heart surgery the third time, she didn't come out of it, and she sort of had a hunch she might not, because I don't think but she went through it because her family really wanted her to give it a shot. I mean, maybe there was a chance she could have gotten through it, but the alternative was she probably would have only lived for another month or two anyway. And when I saw her decide to go through the surgery, make that decision, even though she was really unsure whether this was the right thing, there was a feeling of pride that swelled through me, but it was an external one.
An impressive act.
Yeah, but a very personal one too.
Yeah.
If you're talking about pride in things that I've done myself, or that have happened to me directly, I would say it's probably it has to be associated with a set of recognition that I've gotten. You've gotten some of it as well. I don't know whether you feel that way. Things like the presidential awards that I've gotten for the National Medal of Technology and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Those were very proud moments for me. The Turing Award, that was a proud moment. Some of the honorary degrees, especially the one from Princeton, which, your own alma mater. It's a hard. I mean, I don't tend to characterize things in my life by proudness moments and non-proudness moments, but I certainly think those would have had to be some of the ones that.
Any great golf games that you remember?
I remember a hole-in-one I got, the one and only one I got at Wintergreen once, and the pro there took the golf ball, said they would mount in a trophy, and they never gave it back. But that was a really proud moment.
You and Don Heath have played golf from time to time together, and it seems to me I remember at least one game where you did very well in I don't know what they call them, a doubles thing, or that's tennis.
Yeah, Don and I played a number of times, and in fact I think we won a number of tournaments together. I think the one you're talking, we won one at Avenel, where I'm a member. We won one at Hidden Creek, where he's a member, or was a member. And this particular one was a member guest tournament. And I remember very clearly we were playing what was called ham and egg golf.
I have no idea what
ham
that
and
is.
egging sort of describes an event where when one guy does really badly, the other one does really well, and they basically count the way you do on a function of who did the best on the hole.
Oh, that's a nice arrangement.
So, if it was a hole where Don got an 8 and I got a birdie, they count the 3.
Okay.
Or if I got an 8 and Don got a birdie, they'd count the 3. And not that Don got many 8s, but it was just one of those days where things were working, and we didn't shoot that much better than our normal score. I think he shot an 81, I shot an 88 that day. But when you looked at the combination, the ham and egg effect, we ended up with a 61.
Wow.
And the funny part of it was, we probably missed 7 or 8 shots that were within 2 or 3 feet, little putts that we had missed along the way, and we thought it was going to take something like a 54 to win the tournament. So when we finished at 61, we thought,
well, it's all over.
We're not even close, you know. As we were kicking ourselves, how could you miss that little putt? How could you not? I mean, it's right there. And the bottom line was that you know, the nearest competitor was like 68 or 69. So we actually,
that's great.
That was really, but I wouldn't call that a proud moment. I think it was just an effective moment. We were good.
This next question has to do with sort of turning points, and it seems to me that you've already hinted at some, or been pretty clear about some, when Wozencraft told you that you should go off and get some experience. It seems to me that was a really important turning point for you. Can you think of others that you would kind of lump into that category of important changes in direction that, looking back on it, had a big impact on the way your career has unfolded?
Well, I think in recent years, the one thing I would say probably made more difference than anything was getting my wife Patrice in the act with me, because she brought up perspective on things that I don't think I would have ever had myself. I mean, it was one of the really important things to understand how the perspective that she had, particularly copyright and the like, would make a big difference. I think it's really profoundly changed my view on things, and
Is that we will come back to some of the more recent work that you've done, but I wonder whether your interest in digital objects and the like, and the intellectual property that could adhere to them, is partly driven exactly by this exposure to the legal side of things, concepts that you don't normally think of when you're building computer networks, for example.
It certainly had a big impact. I mean, you were talking before about proud moments. I think in terms of the most important moments of my life, it was meeting Patrice and getting involved with her. I mean, it's clear that was just one of the most important things that ever happened, and it probably did change the direction in which I went. You know, when I started working on digital libraries, I thought the problem was technical, and I began to see, mainly with the inputs from her, that the problem wasn't so much technical as it was sort of social, legal, political. I mean, we're dealing with organizations that the people who were making the decisions and controlling things were not the technologists so much as the legal folks. Take any company that's basically in the IP business, whether it's a movie company or a book company, lawyers are pretty critical, and you can come up with the best technical approach in the world, but it's got to make sense to the people who make those decisions.
Just for the record, IP in this case refers to intellectual property and not Internet Protocol.
Right. So, addressing the issues of the technology from the point of view of what the barriers are to getting it out was one of the fundamental insights that I had, and I would have to credit Patrice with that. I mean, it just stuck. I mean, so when you look at the digital object architecture, what you realize it has the potential for allowing a lot of the dialogue between parties that might not normally happen, or would be hard to happen, to be possible to embed within the system. Not that a technology is going to figure out what to embed, but that you have the mechanism to embed it suddenly makes it possible to envision a technology negotiating things that are there on behalf of the decision makers in those companies. So it's a really fundamental insight that is really stuck to this day. And so, I mean, while I love the technology and I love to work on the technological problems, you know, just like you see in the network business today, not everything about networking is about how to get the bits to move faster.
Absolutely true.
You know, and it has to do with decisions that companies want to make about their investments and what can happen and so forth. And I think the digital library field was particularly difficult because there's such a long history in librarianship. And in my career, you know, every time I've tried to talk to people who have that as their business, it doesn't happen so much now, but in the early days, you know, people felt the need to take an hour or two or three explain, you know, that librarians really have been there before and that technologists can't sort of march in and just suddenly understand things.
So this actually leads to a related kind of question. Looking back now, although we have not covered all aspects of your career, and we are going to do that as much as we can anyway, if you look back on all the various things that you've done, what sort of impacts do you sort of see as a consequence of the work you've done? How would you characterize the results of the research, or the results of the projects, or the results of the ideas? If you were, you know, to look back now over this 30, 40-year period, what kind of impact do you see has happened?
Well, I mean, clearly the thing that's gotten the biggest play in the outside world has been the internet, which I guess was something that nobody could have predicted would have evolved exactly as it did. And you know as well as anybody that this is not a thing that a single person did or that occurred without the help of a lot of people over a lot of time. In fact, it really wasn't until the infusion of a lot of the corporate funds into pushing it out that it really became a global and worldwide thing, plus the backing of governments around the world, because it wouldn't have happened if both of those hadn't happened. Might have been an interesting research project. I still think we're a long way away from learning what the final impact of the internet is. And the networks are changing, new networks are coming up, people are constantly trying to reinvent networks. They're constantly trying to say, well, the old ones don't work, we need new ones, and yet there are some things that are pretty constant in all of this as things go forward. The need for connectivity, the need for bandwidth, the need for reliability. I was struck, you know, in a movie that that I had put together for the unveiling of the ARPANET, to listen to all of the computer folks talk about what that was about, and they all talked about it in terms of the technology of the time. You know, the need for a powerful graphics simulator to connect to a remote time-sharing system. I mean, it was all in terms of what was there at the moment. Whereas when you listen to the communication folks, they would talk about the need for reliable communications. They would talk in things that they wouldn't say we need faster light-emitting diodes to move at twice the bandwidth. Now, I think we're now getting to the point where people are actually talking more in terms of the generics. And so the internet is about connectivity. The internet is about access to information. The internet is about reliability, and those will probably be true 10 years from now, 100 years from now, to the extent that that kind of capability exists. Now, if we ever go beyond computers and beyond communications as we now know it to something else, maybe it'll be different, but I can't imagine, you know, how ESP and gravity waves are going to take over very quickly, or what's going to supplant computers in the short term.
If you were to think back for a bit over from both the early years and maybe more recent ones, have you ever had people that you thought of as role models? You've mentioned several people that had a big influence on your life, but do you categorize any of them that way, or characterize any of them that way, or is that not part of the driving gestalt for you?
Well, there are people who clearly had a big influence on my life. But if what you're asking is, have I patterned my behavior after anyone else? I think the answer is probably no, at least not consciously.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the individuals probably had, the individuals probably had the most impact on how I am, probably my parents. And I don't know to what extent that's just genetic and it's therefore in the genes and I behave that way, or because I saw the way they were and I try to act that way. But it's not a very close fit, but it's probably as close a fit as there is.
I would have guessed not. I mean, I don't disagree with the point that you're making about your parents at all, but I'm thinking that your natural spirit of independence, I think, probably makes it unlikely that you would pick anybody to want to pattern your life after, because you don't want it to be patterned after anybody in particular. You want it to be Bob Kahn's pattern.
Well, if I'm a professional golfer, I might give you a different answer, but I'm not.
Well, do you have any advice that you would want to leave with either the current or the future generations about anything, whether it's how you pattern your life or how you approach problems or what things they should be interested in or motivated by?
Well, let's see. I would say
Neither a borrower nor a lender be. I mean,
I would say the first message, which is more of a professional one, is that if you really believe in an idea strongly and you think you have the ability to act on it, even if you don't know exactly how to make it happen, trust in yourself, listen carefully to what other people are saying, but if after listening to all the advice, even if it's negative, you still believe that it's a good idea, go act on it. Trust yourself, have faith in yourself. This was a lesson that I learned because when I got into the networking field in the first place, where I chose to get into the networking field, there were many people who thought this was a dead end, that there was no there. And we had, what did we have in the early days? Large batch processing machines. Maybe a handful of companies might have operating systems and time-sharing machines. But, when AT&T chose not to get into that business early on, it made probably very good business sense for them because there just wasn't a business out there. It may be a research opportunity, but, they got to decide what they want to invest in R&D. Just like, same true with DARPA today. The research community might think that, the following problems should be dealt with, but they have their own agendas, and people need to decide for themselves what's important. So I think that would be message number one. Just sort of believe in yourself, trust your own instincts going forward. I guess the second lesson would be that if you get married, marry a good woman, or the opposite, because that can make a big difference in your ability to get things done. I've been very fortunate because I can not only, I'm fortunate I have the added benefit of a collaborator in parts, but if you're not into a good relationship, it's very hard to find the space and the time to do what you're going to do, without being encumbered. So, a good relationship is really important to being successful in my view. So trust your instincts on that too. Let's see. Another thing that I might say is leave a little room for serendipity in your life. That is, don't plan everything out because you just don't know what's going to happen that can profoundly change you. It could be something like an idea that just shows up out of the blue that completely changes things, or an offhand comment that somebody you trust makes to you, or it could be a random thing that happens, a letter from somebody that makes a suggestion, or something that just happens by virtue of nature that just changes things. So it might not, everything might not be good, and some of that good stuff might be something that you just have to learn to deal with, but don't assume that the way things are now is the way it's going to be, and that you just have to roll with the punches as they come.
There are two aphorisms that come to mind. One of them is man plans and God laughs. And the other one is life is what happens to you when you were planning something else. Probably a lot of
plans,
our careers would follow that latter pattern. Well, let's try switching gears a little bit, Bob. Institutionally speaking, we haven't talked very much about your time at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, and then at DARPA, and then at CNRI. So from the institutional point of view, I'd like to pursue that a bit. And of course, within that context, you had many projects that you introduced or initiated. So as we explore those different time periods, I'd like to expose some of the ideas and problems that you were grappling with. You took Jack Wozencraft's advice, and you ended up at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. What were you doing there? What was the plan?
Well, I don't think there was a plan at all. I think, BBN was an interesting place in that time frame. It's sort of gone through a lot of transformations along the way, but back then there were a lot of just smart people from both MIT and Harvard and elsewhere who were congregated there, and they were pioneering a lot of the advances in computing technology and communications during that period. I think they were just happy to bring smart people into the mix, and have them interact with other people. I met many people there who I've got to know and have maintained long friendships with ever since. The environment there was unlike any other one I had ever been at. And the gentleman who ran the part of the company that I was involved in was a fellow named Jerry Elkind, who was sort of a control theorist, experimental psychologist, computer scientist, and he was sort of across the board. Jerry later ended up trying to do some things at BB&N that were pretty unusual, like he wanted to take the research guys and put them in running an operational part of the business, like telecom. So Jerry ended up being hired by Licklider over to MIT for a while before he ended up going out to Xerox PARC, where he, I guess Bob Taylor hired him in as his boss. I don't know what happened out there because I never really tracked the internal workings of PARC, but I'm sure you could find people from the Xerox days that could explain that. But I found Jerry to be a very interesting fellow to work with. He had another gentleman working for him named Frank Hart. So in some sense, Frank and I were parallel in terms of the reporting structure. But Jerry wore multiple hats, and Frank had just come in from Lincoln Labs, and he was sort of trying to figure out what to do. So in that context, they gave me freedom to go think about anything I wanted.
Roughly, what are we talking about? Is this 1967 or something like that?
I think I joined them in October of 1966.
Okay.
And I stayed there until October of 1972. So I was there just about 6 years. When I joined them, my thought was to go back to MIT, but we got involved in the ARPANET project, which I can explain. And I had to make a determination. Do I go back or do I stay with the ARPANET project? So I opted to stay, figuring, if I really, if they didn't want me in 5 years, then going back now was probably not the right thing, and I wanted to see this project through. So I started working on networking when I was at BB&N because I found it an interesting topic. Most people in my field did not think this was an interesting thing to work on, for the reasons I said before. But I found it an interesting problem, and I thought I was following Jack Wozencraft's advice. Like, I knew why I was trying to solve this problem, because I thought computers to work with computers was a good enough answer. Now, you might say today, well, computers working with computers for what purpose? And I hadn't thought it through to that level. I just had this idea that if computers can interact with each other, all kinds of good things could happen, and that was a good enough answer to his admonition.
Was Bolt, Beranek, and Newman's interest in networking, did that precede the ARPANET project somehow? In other words, you were thrashing around in that area before ARPA released its request for quotation.
That's right.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that.
The RFQ came out of DARPA sometime in the summer of 1968, I had actually been working on most of the problems in networking, buffer control, error control, flow control, all of those issues.
Communications related things primarily.
Right, but to me it was more with a leg in the computer side of the camp than pure communications, because I was not worrying about the traditional communication stuff. I wasn't worrying about phase lock loops and bit sync and BCH codes and the like. I was worrying about more what felt like computer things. In fact, many of the things I was thinking about would have been almost antithetical to the communications view of the world, which was more dictated by Claude Shannon's inveiglements to optimize, find out how to use the maximum efficiency and bandwidth. It came out of all the theories of information theory. But I was looking sort of at it from the other point of view. How do you just make something work, even if it's less efficient? I was not trying to deal with optimization in the mathematical sense. I was trying to deal with make it work in the practical sense, but to try and do a good job of making it as efficient as I could do by thinking it through, or where I couldn't, to enable mechanisms to be invented in the future. So a good example of that, which turned up in the ARPANET project, was when we had to specify what the routing algorithm was. We actually specified one. It was a shortest path algorithm. But the thing that we proposed to build was a mechanism whereby the entries into routing tables could be done by an algorithm. So you could pull this algorithm out, plug another one in, and the internal structure wouldn't change, but you could maybe optimize the algorithm in the future. So I had been generating these memorandums, and I remember Jerry Elkind coming to me one day and saying, "Why don't you share them with the folks at DARPA? They might be interested." I said, okay. I didn't really know much about DARPA at the time. I had learned about them when I got to BBN. I thought my support was sort of internal support from BBN. I suspect they were probably charging it to one of the DARPA contracts, but I don't know that for a fact. And they sent some of those memos into DARPA, and the next thing I know, I think I actually sent it in, with a letter. I think I addressed it to Larry Roberts, basically saying, Jerry told me that you were interested in networking, so here's some stuff I had been doing, and I probably have that letter in my
in your
files
archive somewhere.
So I didn't know Larry, didn't know what he was thinking about. I certainly didn't know about the ARPANET project. I knew none of that at the time. And back comes a phone call from Bob Taylor, who says...
by the way, Bob's role at this point is running the information processing techniques office.
Bob was running the office, and Larry's role relative to him is somewhat confusing to me. I had thought Larry was a program manager in the office, but I've talked to Larry about that, and he describes his role as a special assistant to the director, but placed in the office. So the exact arrangement there is unclear to me. I know Larry there were some issues about him joining and how he got to join, but I believe that he and Bob Taylor were working collaboratively on getting an RFQ out for an ARPANET at the time, but I didn't know it.
Yes, my recollection, just briefly, is that Taylor wanted Larry Roberts to come down from Lincoln Laboratory to run this program, and Larry didn't want to come.
Right.
And if I remember Taylor's story correctly, perhaps you've heard it too, he managed to persuade the director of Lincoln Laboratories that he should send Larry down or he would have problems with funding.
Yeah, I've heard it's anecdotal, but I don't know that for a fact. In any event, Bob called me back and said, we got your letter. We'd like to invite you to come on down, just sort of chat with us. So I didn't know who he was at the time, but I said, he explained, and so I went down, met with him, and we had a very nice discussion. And they explained where they were headed, and they were going to try and get this network built, and they'd like me to be, if I could help them with it, that'd be great. I think it was more of who are you kind of meeting, get to know you. So sometime in the middle, and I don't remember when that took place, but it probably had to be, sometime in the 1967 timeframe. So sometime in the spring, summer of '68, the RFQ shows up on the street, and it lands on my desk. And I'm reading through it, and all kinds of stuff that are in my memos are in this RFQ. The error control mechanism I had described in my memos, the actual picture was in the RFQ. And I'm thinking, that's pretty impressive, you know. It hadn't dawned on me at that time that I would be involved in anything to do with it, because I figured at that time I was getting ready to go back to MIT. I hadn't quite been out the 2 years, and bottom line was that, good, someone's going to build this net. That, I mean, to me, the work that I had done was about as practical as I thought I needed to get to go back and be a mathematician. So Frank Hart shows up in my office one day, and he says, I understand you've got the DARPA RFQ. Can I take a look at it? Who are you? Was my question. He said, well, he's interested in Frank Hart, and he runs a group. They like to build this sort of stuff. Well, fine. We started to chat, and one thing led to another, and Frank decided he wanted to put in a bid for the ARPANET. Except I ended up writing the proposal. He said, you know, which help us put it together. So I actually put together the technical part of the proposal. Severo Ornstein, who was one of Frank's people, was a really good hardware designer. And a lot of what this proposal was about was describing what we would actually build.
Mm-hmm.
So the software part of it you could sort of describe in terms of what had to happen. I mean, you didn't need to give them the lines of code. But if you're going to create hardware, you needed to actually state what you would build. And so Severo and I remember closeted ourselves over in his house one day, and he said, well, what does this have to do? And I said, well, you know, it's got to take this DLE thing, detect it, then look for a sync character, and he's designing the hardware right on the spot while I'm describing what it has to do, which was a kind of an on-the-spot tutorial. I mean, it's like a PhD program in hardware design right on the spot, because I'm seeing ideas in my head suddenly turning into
hardware design.
Hardware, right in front
there.
of my eyes. I'm thinking, this guy is really terrific.
We were just at the point where you and Frank Hart basically are talking about the RFQ from DARPA about the network. And so what you said, you ended up writing the proposal to respond.
Yeah, and I had a lot of help from Severo on the hardware. In fact, Severo was commenting on everything else I was writing, so he was sort of the surrogate for Frank to make sure that what I was writing made sense, because Severo could understand that sort of stuff, and it really worked out very well. That's what became the technical proposal that went into DARPA. It was memorialized in their report 1783 or 63, some number like that. And
could I just ask one little technical detail? Did the BBN proposal make reference to the Honeywell DDP equipment, or so?
Yes.
So it was Severo undoubtedly must have had something to say about that as the hardware guy. So this is a combination of things that BB&N would actually implement in hardware themselves, plus whatever else they had to do to adapt the DDP machines.
What Severo was basically doing was designing the interfaces for the Honeywell machines so that they could take stuff off the Bell modems, take stuff in from the host computers, and doing it sort of in real time with me. The actual choice for the Honeywell machine was probably made by some combination of Frank Hart and Holly Rising, who worked for him. I mean, that was just, we knew we needed a mini computer, and their job was to go out and figure one. And Frank's big issue there was he wanted to be sure it wouldn't break if you dropped it from a truck, so he ended up getting these ruggedized units that were big as refrigerators and heavier than a tank.
It looked like half-inch thick steel with screw eyes on the top where you could lower the thing down to the ground from a helicopter. I mean, the first one that was delivered to UCLA had all of the accoutrement, and people would ask, you know, well, what are they going to do with this thing? And the answer is, we don't know, but if they drop it, it'll survive.
So, I mean, the effort to actually create the ARPANET design was actually a very intense intellectual activity. I mean, in many ways, the packet radio program, which we'll get to later, was a much more complicated development because it had so many other attributes to it. But because this was the first effort, it's sort of like the first missile that you send up, you know, or first rocket into space. I mean, you don't know if it's going to work or survive, and it may be very primitive by comparison, but because it's the first one, intellectually, it had more risk to it because we didn't know whether it would really work as planned or not. So the specs that were out there for the net really were propagated by DARPA, put out in an RFQ, but it was basically asking for something that, it's like when the space program came up, they could put out an RFQ asking for a rocket that would handle a certain payload and be able to come back to the Earth, or whatever the properties were, but it wasn't a detailed design for how to build a rocket by any means. They sort of required a rocket expert to actually do that. And the spec that came out from DARPA for this network, talked about half a second end-to-end delays in the net. It talked about the need to take in packets and deliver them reliably to the other end, but it was not a spec on how to build it. So that's the contribution I really made, was how would you take this basic idea, this specification, and make it into something real? Figure out what the strategy was. It was kind of like what Vint and I did together on the whole internet architecture. I mean, we had sort of started out with a basic idea of what it was, and then together we kind of worked out the details at that level. Now, you still had to turn it into code. The guy who wrote the code was Bill Crowther, in the case of the ARPANET. In the case of the internet, the guys who wrote the code were Vint's group at Stanford and people at UCL in London and at BBN. So
We'll come back to that one,
Okay.
so otherwise we'll get our history all tangled up here.
history is always all tangled up, as you well know.
That's theorem number 205. Coming back to the ARPANET then, BBN submits a proposal and waits for some period of time, and then it gets awarded. How much time does BBN have effectively to actually implement the software, test it, get the hardware all put together, and deliver the first thing?
So the history of the timing, as I recall it, was the proposal went in sometime in late 1968, perhaps September, October, sometime like that. The announcement of it was in December of 68, as I recall, and the start date was probably early 69, January, right after the New Year's. That's my recollection. And it had a 9-month delivery date. I don't know where they got the 9 months from, but it's very anthropomorphic.
It's a common figure in certain species, but anyway.
So the goal was to deliver the first of 4 nodes, which is what that project was about, to UCLA in 9 months. And in fact, it got delivered supposedly a day or two early, the Lord goes, and I think that's right. And I went out and actually helped with the testing of that, both that first node and the first 4 nodes. In fact, that's how I first really got to meet Vint Cerf, who was then sort of the point person on that for UCLA, working on Glenn Kleinrock's lab, I believe. And Vint was very helpful with a lot of the testing of that from the Sigma 7. Now, when the first imp showed up, the Sigma 7 was not connected, as I recall.
That's correct.
That didn't happen until later. So the initial tests that we did were just tests on that machine itself.
The imp itself.
And various testing things, because it had a teletype connected to it and the like. And I actually have a book somewhere about all the details of the testing that we did. But later on, I went back with Dave Walden, who was one of the key software guys in that group, and we actually did the first 4-node testing of that network. In fact, I think we may have actually done some intermediate testing, and I can't recall it right now. I'd have to go back and check the records, because it may not be that we waited until all 4 nodes were back before verifying that the intermediate could work. But I do know we did the 4-node tests. I do know we did some of the 1-node testing right after it arrived, and there may have been one in between, and I'd have to check records.
I honestly don't recall anything intermediate. I think my recollections most strongly are of the arrival of the machine at UCLA and all the trouble we had physically getting it into place. Mike Wingfield trying to work the BBN 1822 interface hardware design for the Sigma 7 computer that would drive it or use it. And then you and Walden coming back either late in 69 or early in 70, and my recollection is it was early in 70. By that time we did have the Sigma 7 installed, because we went through a whole raft of tests to drive traffic into the imp to see what it would do. Now, my recollection is that when you came out, you had in mind some problems that you thought would be exhibited under certain conditions, and your colleagues didn't think that they would happen, or that the probability was so low that they could be ignored.
You really want to get into all of
well,
that?
I think at least a little bit of that would be appropriate, and then I recognize, well, otherwise we don't want to dive so deep into ARPANET we never get to anything else. But I thought these ideas that you had that your colleagues kind of dismissed were pretty important.
Well, I thought
suspicions.
they were too. Katie Hefner is a wonderful writer. She's written for Newsweek magazine. She occasionally writes for the New York Times. And she wrote a book that was a really great read. It was called Where Wizards Stay Up Late. And Katie sent me an early version of that book where she had gotten a recount of what happened here from a number of people. I don't know exactly who. And I read it and I said, Katie, that's just not what happened. And what she described was my going out to UCLA and running these tests and discovering that the network froze, locked up. Sort of like the packets got all clogged up in some area. And she said in this write-up, and it was just totally wrong, but she said in the write-up that I then went back to BBN and reported what I had discovered, and that I wanted to write a simulation program to go study it, and that Frank Hart basically said no because we have a real network, and he instructed people to go fix the problem. And then, well, long story short, Katie ended up taking that part out of it. I wanted her to write it and do it right, but I guess she didn't have enough time. So she literally deleted that whole part from the book. But the reality was, I sent her a paper that I had published at a Princeton University conference describing the simulation that we had already built a year earlier, before we even got the contract on the network, to look at the problems of deadlocks, which I knew were a possibility, and we had actually built the simulation. Warren Teitelman did the implementation. It was really Warren was the BBN Lisp, he was an interLisp guy for a while, and I think he may now be at Google for all I know. I believe he's working.
Well, I'll have to look into that. That's interesting.
I got a note from him recently. He's been doing some work for Google. Anyway, Warren wrote that part of that program. It was a really interesting one because most people were working on Model 33 teletypes, and this produced an interactive graphics display off the time-sharing system when people just weren't doing that. And so you could actually design a network, put the nodes, you could decide what kind of traces at each of the nodes, you could watch the packets flow through the net, you could collect all the statistics, and you could actually see the lockups, you could evaluate routing algorithms and the like. And we built that, and Jerry Elkind, who was then running the group, had just learned that the contract was awarded, and he said, if you want to keep working with that simulation, you ought to charge that to Frank Hart's contract. Frank Hart was the PI on the ARPA contract. I thought once we'd won the contract, I was going to bail out and end up going back to teach. Except that Frank refused to let me charge to the contract. And Jerry was saying, you can't charge. I mean, this was politics 101 right in front of me. Jerry said, we can't fund it here. It's got to come out of that. And Frank was saying, I don't want you working simulations because we already have a real network we're building. Use that. And oh, by the way, if you want to charge to the contract, I want you over here working for me. So after debating it, I picked my office up and I literally moved over to the part of BBN where people didn't do that. I mean, this was, the equivalent of moving from the math department to the chemistry department. And I mean, it was a major move. People were, I think, very surprised when I had made the move. But to me, it was survival. I mean, it was survival in two ways. Number one, because I couldn't continue to do what I was doing without it. And number two, they didn't understand that there was a real problem. In my opinion, they didn't understand that. So we went over there, and what we ended up doing was not working on the simulation because I wasn't permitted to, but trying to figure out how to make sure that the implementation didn't have these problems. But because I didn't control the coding, Bill Crowther was writing it. When I went out to do the field testing, that was my job, both designing it and then testing it to see that it worked. The first thing I went out to do was to show that it would lock up because I had proposed and wrote for the proposal all kinds of mechanisms to deal with this issue. And it was overruled because the feeling was, the likelihood of packets clogging up the net, because there are going to be so many of them going all over the place, was about as likely as all the oxygen molecules in this room suddenly showing up in that corner and therefore us all suffocating. It's just not going to happen, and if it does, we'll deal with it later. That was the point of view. So that's what I did. I went out, locked it up. So when Katie went to report it, she said I went out there and I discovered it from my experimentation.
As opposed to deliberately inducing the effect.
I induced the thing I knew about all along. So we ended up fixing the problem eventually. It took a while. We came back and reported it. Dave Walden actually did the report, and nobody believed it, even though we had the physical data. And it took a while before Bill Crowther's conscience must have gotten to him, and Bill Crowther ended up writing his own simulation in the back room to sort of verify it. He came back and reported it to Frank and said, there's a problem here, the thing that Bob was talking about, can really happen. Frank came to me and said, how come I didn't know about this? And so I said, you did. I reported it, but he either didn't remember or it hadn't gotten through, or he needed to hear it from one or two of his critical people. And so we then spent the next year redoing the whole implementation to deal with that problem. It was a major redo of the software. Finally fixed it, and when it finally got fixed, my view was, okay, I'm off the hook now. I know this thing is going to work. I picked myself up and moved back across the bridge to the group that Jerry Elkind had been running. Jerry, by that time, had gone to MIT to work for Licklider, and Licklider had hired him over there. And I think Danny Barbara was running the group at the time. And Bert Sutherland was working for him. These are two people who later went to Xerox PARC.
These are all legends in the industry,
along
of course.
with Warren Titleman, of course. And so I moved back, and shortly thereafter ended up planning the first public demonstration of the ARPANET at the Washington Hilton, and right after that ended up going to DARPA. Larry Roberts had actually offered me the job at DARPA something like May of '71, and I wasn't prepared to do that at that point because we hadn't finished what we needed to do. And eventually I decided that that was in fact the thing I would do, and I decided to go to DARPA literally to run a project in automated manufacturing. I was going to sort of say, okay, that's it for networking. I'm finished. I'm going to do something different.
It's a permanent infection that you can't get rid of.
You're stuck with your own history. Is
something like that. Now, actually, getting to DARPA in 1972 was a little more complicated than simply picking up and going there. My recollection is that Larry had asked you to organize the demonstration at the International Conference on Computer Communications in the Washington Hilton Hotel in October of that year. And you drew on a lot of the ARPANET community to do that. I remember being there, and many of my contemporaries too. But then it seemed to me that somehow or other there was a funny swap between you and Larry Roberts, because BB&N had gotten interested in the possibility of commercial networking, and that manifested itself in the form of a company called Telenet. So can you tell us a little bit about your involvement in the formation of Telenet and Larry Roberts' involvement subsequently as you leave BB&N and join DARPA?
Well, my recollection is that BB&N there had been discussions about setting up a commercial operation out of BB&N, but the company had not decided to do it. I think Frank might have liked to do it. They had hired a gentleman whose name I don't recall from Washington to come up there, and he left to start what became the very first packet company in the United States called Packet Communications, Inc. And they filed with the FCC to get permission because they thought they needed to at the time, probably did. But that company didn't get anywhere. It didn't. I don't know the details of it, but it didn't actually survive. But when he left, BB&N almost instantaneously made the decision to go down that path, almost as a antibody reaction, I think. And Steve Levy approached me. Steve was, at that point, the sort of the entrepreneur in the company. I think he might have been the CFO or treasurer. This was Steve's bailiwick to do these sort of things. And he sat down, he and I went together and planned out the creation of this company, Telenet. Steve was the first president of it, and he wanted me to stay on with Telenet in some chief technology role. I had already agreed to go to DARPA a few months before. So this would have been like maybe May or June of 1972 that I told Larry that I would come to DARPA. And aside from the issues of integrity of telling somebody you're not going to do something you decided to do, I really wanted to work on this automated manufacturing project. I thought it was really interesting in so many dimensions.
Okay,
and
we
it was
need to come back to that
it was a
because
big
we
project.
don't know about that. But
It was a big project. So Steve and I agreed to work with Steve over the next several months to plan Telenet. So it was just Steve and myself doing it. None of the people that were Frank's group were involved in this. In fact, it was a big surprise to him, I think, when he found out that this was happening. And they set up Telenet. I think it was in August of '72, formally. It was housed up in the Boston area at BB&N. And when I joined DARPA, which was in October, Larry Roberts left at about the same time to become the second president of Telenet. Most people think he started it, but he was actually the second president. And he persuaded Steve Levy to let them move the operation down from Boston area to the Washington area. And they set up shop, somewhere around 16th and K, or 17th and K, in one of those corner buildings. And so that's how Telenet got its operation. Larry had left and he became involved in that for quite a while. And I ended up at DARPA trying to run this manufacturing program.
So did Larry also bring Barry Wessler with him to the Telenet activity?
Yes, Barry had been a program manager at DARPA. I think he went with him. Interestingly enough, Barry was in one of my classes up at MIT when I was there, so I actually knew him from way back.
I'm not surprised. I mean, this is a small community, and there's just an amazing amount of interaction and coincidence, I think.
So I believe Barry and Larry worked together on that for quite a while.
So when you talked to Larry about coming to DARPA, what was it that it was proposed that you do there?
Well, they had proposed in their congressional filings to set up a program in automated manufacturing. It was purported to be a fairly large program, hundreds of millions of dollars kinds of numbers. And back in the 70s, that was real dollars.
That was real money.
I was interested in for a number of reasons, because the whole idea of how you make things in factories by specifying designs and causing machinery to get put in place that would cause it to be built. I could see network activities taking place on the factory floor. I could see database systems. I could see artificial intelligence. I could see computer-aided design. I could see real utility, which is starting to more and more influence what I did. And so I found it kind of a rich, brand new area. Nobody had really done this before, and that appealed to me. And leaving the networking stuff behind was difficult, but I didn't see any way that I could be very much more productive in the networking field at that point, because to do it would have required that I stay at BB&N to do it. I was now back in a different division. We had all of those old political schisms and funding schisms, and I was looking for the next thing for me. BB&N had the view that the ARPANET was going to be the network for the world in general. Didn't quite turn out that way, but it was a big deal for the DoD, particularly in terms of the defense data net that it was a part of, became part of later on. But this seemed like a really good move for me. So that's what I went to DARPA to do. And about a month or two after getting there, Larry broke the news to me that, it must have been very quickly, he broke the news to me. I don't know when he learned. He might have even learned before I came, but I've never asked him, that the Congress had killed the program.
So actually what this says is that you and Larry didn't switch positions at the same time. You came to DARPA while Larry was still running the office.
We overlapped
and then he left subsequent to that.
I came in
October.
End of October '72. He left in September of '73.
Oh, so there was almost a year of overlap.
So there was close to a year of overlap.
Okay, I had misunderstood that this was almost simultaneous, but it was
No,
not.
and it wasn't a swapping of positions because Larry replaced Steve Levy running Telenet. They hired him in as the CEO.
Okay.
Whereas I had no formal role with Telenet ever. I mean, I was on the BBN staff working with Steve and setting it up, but I declined to get involved with it directly.
Okay, so you weren't an officer of Telenet,
I had
just helping facilitate that.
I had no role with Telenet by my choice, but I worked very closely with Steve in setting it up.
Sure.
So,
So when you came to DARPA and this automated manufacturing program gets canceled, what happens then?
see, I don't know that it got canceled. I don't know that it ever got started.
Well,
I mean,
okay, fair
I
enough.
was sort of hired to go do that on the assumption that it was in the budget and would happen, but it never actually happened. And at that point, I seriously thought about just that. I came there to do that thing and was packing up and maybe go back up to Boston. Probably not back to BBN, but probably back to MIT.
Is it fair to say that you could not, under government rules, have then taken over responsibility for the ARPANET project because you'd been working on it at BBN, or was there any issue there?
You know, the bottom line is I don't know, but I chose not to get involved in any event, partly because of the fact that that's where I had been. There were enough issues that I was part of at the time. Personality conflicts, technical judgment issues. It just made no sense for me to go there because all it was going to be was arm wrestling one way or another. So I never got involved with the ARPANET project in all the time I was at
And
DARPA.
Larry continued to run it then while he was still the office director?
Larry masterminded the whole thing when
Uh-huh.
he was at DARPA. I mean, it was his specification. He pushed it. The ARPANET would never have happened if it weren't for what Larry had done. Of course, he got support from Bob Taylor. He got support from Charlie Hertzfeld, who was the director. When it started, he got support from Ed Breckton. He got support from Steve Lukasik. So he had continuing support along the way. But Larry was the key.
So when he left the year later, was Steve Walker the one who ended up with responsibility for ARPANET at that point?
Steve Walker was responsible for a period of time. I think he was responsible during that initial period. And then Licklider had come in 1974 when Larry left, and he hired Craig Fields to join the office. And Craig, I think, took over the ARPANET responsibility and ran that for a while. But I had people would talk to me, they'd ask me, what about this, what about that, because I was a kind of font of knowledge, having been instrumental in initiating it. But I just wanted nothing to do with the project myself.
At least not in any official capacity.
I didn't want to have to deal with the BB&N folks on that particular project.
So after the manufacturing project doesn't happen, what did you wind up occupying yourself with?
Well, I was getting prepared to leave. And Larry basically set me down and said, look, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. You know as much about networking as anybody in the country at this point, and I think that probably included him. He said, we got too many options and opportunities in the future, more networks we can create, and you need to make that all happen. And it was persuasive enough for me, having just moved down, having just bought a house, I mean, to just sort of undo all of that in the span of no time just didn't really appeal to me. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And I got involved in setting up a number of programs. I think the one that was most immediate was the packet radio program. I mean, to apply packet switching technology to mobile radios. People had been thinking about it. I mean, the idea of such radio nets did not originate with me. Norm Augustine and Frank Kuo had gotten funding years before to build something called the Aloha Net on Hawaii to link radio terminals.
Sorry to interrupt. I think you meant Norm Abramson.
Yes, what did I say?
Norm Augustine, who was over at, it's Norm Abramson.
Norm Abramson?
At University of Hawaii.
Sorry,
right?
I know Norm too. So Norm Abramson and Frank Kuo, the University of Hawaii, had gotten funding for something called the Aloha Net, to link by radio terminals to the central computer at the university. So the idea was about, but nobody had ever tried to actually build a whole network of radio nodes that could do relaying.
Do you recall roughly when the Aloha network was going on? And the reason I'm asking is that there is some correlation with work on Ethernet and Bob Metcalfe. And there's a confluence in here of another person whose name hasn't come up, and that's Steve Crocker, who I went to high school with and later was at UCLA with as a graduate student. But the reason I bring it up is that Metcalfe was exposed to the Aloha net at Steve Crocker's house here in Washington when Steve was still at DARPA. So could you say a little bit about when the Aloha net was happening and when did Steve join DARPA, or ARPA at the time? Was it before or after your arrival? Do you remember?
He was there before me. I think he showed up there sometime in the 1970 or 71 time frame.
Okay.
And he left shortly after I got there. We did not overlap very long.
Right.
My recollection was that the original funding for the Aloha net actually came out of either ONR or AFOSR. It was a small thing that DARPA then picked up and helped to grow into a larger effort. And that it started roughly at the same time the ARPANET did. So I would have dated it, and this is without checking my historical facts, I would have dated it roughly to 1969.
Okay.
What happened before then, pre-planning, I just don't know.
No, this sounds pretty consistent because my recollection is that they named the device that was handling the radio packets the Menehune, which was supposed to be an imp or a little,
Little Hawaiian imp.
a little leprechaun. And that probably was a side effect of having seen what the ARPANET packet switch was called as well.
I think Dick Binder, who later worked for CNRI, actually at one point told me that that was the name he chose because he was working on the project as one of the people, but I don't know that for a fact, and I may be recollecting that
Well,
wrong.
but that sounds like about the right time frame because my recollection is Metcalfe goes out to University of Hawaii just before he comes back to Xerox PARC and invents the Ethernet with Dave Boggs. And that's all like 1973. So what happened now? You've been exposed to this packet radio idea. Has the project actually started at that point, or are you?
No, there was no project in place. I mean, Larry had been thinking about it, my guess. As with many things, had Larry stayed at Lincoln Labs, I'm sure he could have built the ARPANET. Had Larry stayed on at DARPA, I'm sure he could have made the packet radio program happen. I mean, it wasn't like every one of these were inspirational things.
Understood.
The hard part was, I think, in conceptualizing them and architecting them and causing them to be created. When I first started working on the ARPANET, I thought it was a new idea with me. I mean, I was not familiar with the stuff that Len had done or Paul Barron had done or Donald Davies. I was just exploring what I thought was an interesting idea. So, when I brought it to the attention of the folks at DARPA, I had no idea that they were even thinking about networking or knew any of that stuff. But the packet radio work was a clear extension of the ARPANET. Instead of the nodes being fixed nodes with a lot of wire connections, they'd be mobile nodes with a lot of radio connections. So the idea was evident as to what this was, but how to do it was a matter of a program, and that's what I set up to formalize.
What was the motivation behind doing the ARPANET in the first place, and what continued that motivation in packet radio and packet satellite, which we've sort of bumped into a little bit
Vint, I'm surprised
on.
you don't know by now.
I'm sorry?
That's a tongue-in-cheek comment. I know you know well. So just for the record, I would say that the motivations were multiple. Motivation number one was to explore the area of computer network resource sharing. So different computers. We were dealing with an era back then where the machines were all different. We didn't really have a lot of portability, and so if you wanted to use a resource, you sort of had to go there or get there through a network. Programs on the ILIAC weren't going to run anywhere else, and there were a lot of specialized resources as well. So trying to figure out how to share resources. If you had a simulation program running on one machine and somebody wrote one on another, how could they work together? It was an opportunity for the future. I mean, to sort of break new ground. So that was one motivation. A second motivation was specifically to allow the research community access to specific resources. So accessing a very large database storage system wasn't so much an interaction thing, although maybe you want to bring it back to another machine, but maybe you just want to see a data point on a screen. So that, I kind of lumped those two together in sort of the computer resource sharing activity. But the second question was, how could you build a network that would facilitate that in an economic and efficient way? So the use of the regular telephone network just didn't seem appropriate. Number one, the bandwidth was too small. I mean, maybe you could get 2.4 kilobits, but people were thinking we need at least an order of magnitude more than that. I mean, how could you possibly have a network that only had 2.4 kilobits of bandwidth in the backbone? And especially if you're multiplexing a lot of users. Number two, how could you do it reliably? Because phone lines made errors and computers needed perfect communication. And so the bottom line was it really needed a rethinking of how to do the networking in a cost-effective way. You could have bought lines and hooked everything up in a fully connected way, but this idea of packet switching had been floating around. And so DARPA was interested in showing that packet switching, in fact, was an efficient way of dealing with computer communications. They were trying to demonstrate a new mode of communications. And then finally, another motivation for it, although it wasn't so much funded in the research community as through interactions with some military sites, was to show its utility for command and control on a more global basis. But that was not driving it. That was one of the stated applications of it that they would explore. I think the motivation was more of a research motivation at the time.
But the command and control argument surely must have resonated with the people who fund DARPA, recognizing that computers could be used in command and control to manage resources better than they would otherwise. I seem to remember from that time period phrases like force multipliers that would allow a smaller force to overcome a bigger one because you could manage the resources better with the help of computers.
It is certainly true. Everybody understood that the potential was there. And at some level, you could argue that it was supported because of that potential, certainly at the level of the director or down below. But if you look at the people in the trenches who were building the technology and doing it, they thought they were solving a technical problem. And I think that was, I mean, this was not a military problem that had some urgency. They needed to decide by how to get a solution by 2 weeks from Friday.
No, in fact, the art of ARPA, I always thought, was transforming problems that were known to be faced by the military into problems that the research community could work on without having very much awareness or exposure to the specific military application. But since you mentioned packet radio and mobile computing, I mean, it's pretty clear that that's tactical. And there's the ships at sea problem, which must have led to use of satellites for that communication. So somewhere in this picture, packet satellite pops up too. Is that part of the ensemble of things that you were working on?
You know, well, I would take a lot of credit for the ARPANET work, certainly designing that, and I would take much of the credit for the packet radio stuff, architecting. I was sort of the chief architect of that. And orchestrated the building of it too. The packet satellite work had a very different history. I would argue that as a network concept, Larry Roberts really started that one. He was never able to follow through. I mean, he had done some early analysis of slotted Aloha on satellites as opposed to plain Aloha, which Aloha was a technique, a name of a technique that the Aloha net had created, where if you had a radio net, just send whenever you feel like it and just hope it doesn't collide with something. It would be like a traffic management system that basically said, go anywhere you want, anytime, and if you collide, we'll retransmit you. Not very good for cars, but it did work for packets. And if the traffic was light, most of the time you wouldn't collide with anything. Well, it turned out there was some theoretical limits, and Larry showed that by time slotting the channel, you could avoid some of the collisions that would occur when things were very close to each other by just making sure that they missed a little bit, and then you could double the capacity. So people were thinking about that, and he had even funded BBN to build a variant of an ARPANET IMP that had more memory to control a satellite channel. Unfortunately, at the time, he was not thinking about the satellite channel as being anything more than a modem connected to the IMP. So it was just like any other connection except it went through a satellite. And there were no satellites to use. So even though BBN had been funded to sort of write the code, there was no deployment plan that was possible at that time because nobody had worked on it. And the biggest issue with that whole approach, as I discovered when I got to DARPA, was there was no way to separate that into two separate nets. That is, the satellite net, as it finally became known, actually became a separate net because we split it apart and we defined interfaces between the satellite piece and the ARPANET piece that allowed the standard ARPANET interface to be used to the ARPANET, and we defined a separate interface to the satellite net. And that allowed for a device to be put in place, which we called a gateway, that eventually became critical to the original evolution of the internet. Well, as long as both pieces of software in one machine, then all the interactions between the two are in-core memory transfers controlled by one group at BBN, and to me, that was a non-starter. So the internet never would have happened if that was the model that we applied in every single case. That is, every single other network was like a modem connection to the ARPANET. The ARPANET would then be the central thing that kept propagating. We'd never get different administrative controls, different administrative participants, different political. I mean, the open architecture that led to the internet never could have happened that way.